Gerai, pažiūrėjom šitą ir dabar klausysim šitą. Tai gerai, ar religija yra naudinga visuomeniai? Kaip aš atsakyčiau tą klausimą šią akimirką ir tada pažiūrėsim, kaip ar pasikeistų po pokalbio. Kaip aš atsakyčiau šitą klausimą? Ar religija naudinga visuomeniai? Ne. Dabartiniai visuomeniai. Ar religija naudinga visuomeniai? Visuomeniai, kuri būtų geresnė ir link kurios aš norėčiau, kad mes eitumėm, ne. Visuomeniai, kuri yra dabar, kokia yra dabar, gali būti. Bet nesakyčiau kategoriškai, kad naudinga. Gali būti kartais naudinga, nes jin pasiūlo keletą dalykų, kur kai kurios visuomenės neturi pakaitalo. Tai jo, mūsų netobulai ir blogai visuomeniai, gal blogesniai visuomeniai arba praeities visuomeniai, religija gali būti naudinga. Jo, čia tas pats argumentas, kad, na, nežinau, ten senovinis kažkoks alternatyvus dantų gydymas turbūt geriau negu nieko, bet dabartinė medicina yra daug geresnė, negu kad buvo. Tai čia tas, jo, religija gal ir turėjo kažkada, kai, nu, daugiau pliusų ir panašiai, nes nieko geriau nebuvo. Ir mes net negalėjom kaip visuomenė pasiūlyti, kad pakeistų tą smegenų nuodą. Gal ir galim tai sakyti, kad buvo, arba galimai gali būti naudinga, bet kaip be būtų, dabar aš skaičiau šiuolaikiniai visuomeniai, kur mes realiai galim visus tos pliusus, kur religija, tarkim, turėtų, ar kur religijos šalininkai ginčytų, kad religija turi ar suteikia, mes jos gan nesudėtingai turbūt galėtumėm pakeisti dalykais, kurie nereikalautų šalutinių religijos poveikių, šalutinių tų tikėjimų ir panašiai. Tai jo, gal taip apibūdinčiau. Prisiminus, ką aš ir pasakiau, tipo. Nes visuomenėje, kur, aš tiesiog baninu šitą žmogų, aš nežinau, lietuvių kalba mes galim susišnekėti? Ar jis dabar pasakai, kad nerašyk nesąmonių, jeigu nori kalbėti, kalbėsim balsu. Tai ką jis tada darys? Aš noriu parašyti, leiskit man parašyti, tu toliau rašai nesąmonės dalbajobė. Jeigu nori kažką pasakyti, ateik ir balsu šnekėk. Viskas. Jeigu nenori kažko pasakyti, valink nahu iš čia. Čia te nerašinėsi. Kas neaišku? Kiek kartų dar reikės paaiškinti? Vos ne lietuviškai, suprantit? What the fuck? Kas su tam iš vis gali norėti šnekėti, kad toks dalbajobas neiškenčiamas? Gerai, sorry, grįžtam atgal. Senesnį kartą yra naudinga, nu jo, bet realiai, aš nežinau, kada čia parašai, bet jo čia aš tą ką ir pasakiau. Bet vat, aš ir ginčiu tą, kad tie pliusai bendruomenių, ten dar kažko religijų, kaip kaupim mechanizmų ir panašiai, jie realiai veikia ir turi naudą tik tada, kai mes nepasiūlom geresnės alternatyvos, o tų geresnių alternatyvų jau dabar yra ir mes turėtume jas siūlyti. Tai aš iš tos pusės taip gal apibūdinčiau. Organai, neįtikėtina yra tas, kad aš nežinau, kada paskutinis banas buvo gal prieš kokius 5 mėnesius, čia šiandieną nusprendė vienas psichas ateit dar kur jo, bet pas mus labai senai jau tokių nebūna. Paskutinis turbūt buvo Vatnikas, kur irgi mes su juo šnekėjom, Discord'e balsu ir tada jis vien dieną nusprendė, kad balsu nebešnekės, bet tada spamins Discord'ą visus chatus, tipo, nu jo, ten. Aš jį po kažkurio pokalbio buvau užbanęs iš Discord'o, paskui baną nuėmiau, bet jis nebeėjo balsu šnekėti, tiesiog spamino chat'e, tada baną gavo. Gerai, intarpas toks, tai aš taip apibūdinčiau, religija naudinga visuomeniai gal. Bet sudėtinga tema šita būtų.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists...
Čia realiai Ben Shapiro iš karto pasakė tą, ką aš jums sakiau, tik kad jisai pasakė, nu čia mes deisim iki to, tik kad to dar nereplaisino, ar neturim kaip replaisint, bet jo, vien tai, kad mes neturim kaip replaisint, arba nereplaisinom, turim kaip replaisint, bet nereplaisinom, nereiškia, kad religija yra geras.
Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms.
This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So, thanks again.
The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts. A lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider...
Man kilo klausimas, religija pradėjo karus ir juos sustabdė. Kai kuriuos pradėjo, dėl sustabdymo nesu tikras, ar ten galima kažką priskirti, bet religija, apsitai aš sakyčiau, pats tikėjimas kaip konceptas buvo, yra kaip pradas nesutarimui ir tada nemokėjimui spręsti nesutarimo ir tada karui. Bet aš apie religiją ir tą buvau užsirašęs. Blemba, dabar aš neturiu, aš buvau pasirašęs, aš kalbėjau su Ramūnu apie religiją ir ten mano opening statementas buvo, kur man patiko ta, kad ten yra kažkokia knyga, kur ten blogiausi ir žiauriausi maždaug įvykiai žemėje ir gan didelis skaičius jų yra religiniai visokie karai ir panašiai ten atrocities tokie padaryti žmonių. Bet kaip būtų, mes galim turbūt daug pavyzdžių rasti, kur religija padėjo žmogui ar kur religija užmušė žmogų. Čia nemanau, kad didelė prasmė būtų taip pavyzdžių kuo daugiau rinkti. Pats konceptas tiesiog turbūt svarbiau. Jeigu tu pasikliauni tikėjimu savo moralams, savo vertybei ir sutinki kitą žmogų, kuris turi priešingus moralinės vertybės ar panašiai, nes jam tikėjimas taip liepia. Jūs neturit kaip išspręsti šito racionaliai. Jeigu tavo Dievas tau sako, kad tu gali užmušti priešą ir kad tu būsi teisus, čia nėra jokio ginčo. Čia yra tiesiog visiškas nuodas smegenų. Todėl aš ir sakau, kad jeigu tavo moralinės vertybės ateina iš tikėjimo, o ne iš filosofinio apmąstymo kažkokio ar įvertinimo, aš nepasitikiu tavo vertybėm. Tavo vertybės stovi ant labai silpno pamato. Nes tu neturi tada nei kaip nesutarimų, kaip čia nesutarimų išspręsti ar panašiai. Ir galų gale, jeigu tu davesi du tikinčius iki ekstremo, kurie literally nebegali, išsiaiškinti, o turi kažkaip egzistuoti, greičiausiai bus karas ar viens kitą galės užmušti ten ar panašiai, nes jie neturi kaip išspręsti tada pagal tą sistemą to nesutarimo. O tarpu tokio kaip ten demokratinio kokio šalyje ar panašiai, ir diskutuosit ir galų gale toleruosit ir diskutuosit, nes negalim žudyti ne dėl to, kad religija pasakė, o dėl to, kad filosofiškai mes tokius įstatymus sukūrėm, kad negali to daryti, nes bus uždarytas į kalėjimą, bent jau bus pasiekmė. O jeigu tu kliausies religiją, tai, kitas žmogus tada, kuriam religija sako, kad gali žudyti, jis gali tada žudyti, tu tik negali, nes tavo religija tau neleidžia, o jisai gali, nes jam leidžia, tai yra absurdas. Arba sustabdė vystymas iš 1000 metų, pavyzdžiui, astronomija, kai nusprendė, kad aplink Žemę viskas sukas ir degino mokslininkus, bandant išrodyti, kad aplink Saulę sukas. Buvo tokių istoriškai labai daug.
Civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here.
If you want more from today's conversation, register now and you'll have a chance to win a free ebook. And tell us who persuaded you in our survey with today's show.
Na, aš nežinau, Ben Shapiro čia turės neapginamą poziciją, tai man įdomu, kokius iš argumentus išvis sakys, bet aš nemanau, kad yra gerų argumentų už religiją ar už tikėjimą. Tai...
Welcome to The Big Conversation, part of Premier Unbelievable's roster of shows brought to you in partnership with the Templeton Foundation. I am your host, Andy Kind. Today we are talking about a very interesting topic. The question is religion good or bad for society? And I've been joined by two very dapper chaps, Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor, who most of you maybe, will be completely aware of. We're going to have a very substantive conversation. I'm going to introduce them first. I'm going to give a little summary on who they are, and stop me if you've heard this before. So Ben Shapiro is a prominent American conservative political commentator and columnist. Okay so far?
So far, so good.
A graduate in political science from UCLA and the Harvard Law School, Ben has authored over a dozen books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. He is co-founder and editor emeritus of The Daily Wire and host of the aptly titled Ben Shapiro Show, which in 2021 was ranked in the top 10 most listened to Apple podcasts. He also has a YouTube channel with over 6 million subscribers. Kudos to you, sir. Joining Ben today is Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor is a YouTuber and host of the Within Reason podcast, a philosophy platform designed to present philosophical discussions in an accessible format. A graduate of philosophy and theology from St John's College, Oxford University, he is also an international public speaker and debater, having defended his philosophical convictions against a wide range of experts across multiple continents, and whose online video material has been viewed more than 70 million times. Is that true?
It might be more now, actually, depending on
more than 70 million times.
That was written.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's great to have you both. Thank you both for taking the time. And for both of you, I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. So hopefully we're going to have a lot of good stuff.
We're
talking about religion and society and how they interconnect. And we want to know, really, and I'd like to get this settled once and for all at the end of this conversation so nobody else ever has to discuss it if we can. Is religion good for society? Can a society hold together if there are no underlying beliefs that everybody shares? And we're going to be exploring what both of you believe are the most important principles undergirding any civilization. What are the foundations of morality and ethics based on? So, without further ado, let's start. I'm not going to go into backstory too much because most people will be aware of who you are, and there'll be a lot of fanboys and girls out there watching. But let's talk about something that, Ben, you have spoken on, and Alex, you have responded to, this idea of the atheist delusion. Ben, could you sort of concisely, if you can, talk about what you mean by the atheist delusion?
Sure. So I should start off by saying I don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God. I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another, and so I'm not going to try and do that with Alex today, because I think if people would have been able to provide dispositive proofs, then people would believe them. And if people were able to provide dispositive proofs that God does not exist, then people would be more apt to believe those as well. What I think is an atheist delusion is that it is possible to live ideologically purely in a way that does not rely on fundamental faith principles. When I say faith principles, I'm not going to make the claim that those faith principles are direct from Sinai or that those faith principles require the New Testament, for example. I'm going to make the claim that there are a bunch of principles upon which we base ourselves that are external to what we know about nature and evolutionary biology, and that many of the things that Alex does in his daily life, for example, are going to be things that rely on principles that are external to a philosophy that would assume a lack of the supernatural, a lack of the extra natural. So some of those principles, for example, are free will. So every day we get up, we believe, virtually all of us, whether we say we believe it or not, we actually act in ways that betray the idea that we believe that we have control over our own actions, at least to a certain extent, and that control makes a difference in the world. And
aš nepauzinsiu ką žodį, bet aš prašysiu viskuo nesutinku, ką jis sako. Ir čia yra jo opening premise, ant kurio jis stato savo argumentą.
That's what gives us purpose. It's what allows us to wake up in the morning and make the decision to do what we believe is right or what we believe is wrong. That the principles of right and wrong are external to evolution.
Bet čia jau yra įskiepytas tas what we believe is right or wrong, bet tu gali tą daryti dėl to, kad tu žinai, kad tai yra right or wrong, nes tu iš filosofijos gavai to savo, o ne iš tikėjimo. Bet čia gali būti jau, aš nežinau, kur semantika prasideda, kur ne, bet čia viskas, ką jis realiai kaip įstato tą savo, yra flawed, arba daro prielaidą, tarsi būtų teisinga, nors mes dar nepakalbėjom, kad ta prielaida būtų teisinga. Tokių tarsi dogmų panaudoja.
Biology. So both of these principles that I've mentioned already, free will, right and wrong, these come from a language that is external to the Darwinian language of evolutionary biology. If you're talking about free will, there is nothing in nature that suggests the ability to make a decision free of environment and genetics in combination in some sort. The same thing is true of right and wrong, the idea that there is a right and there is a moral wrong that we can reason our way to. Another principle that I think that you're obviously very big on, it's something that you rely on all the time, your entire podcast is based on the idea of reason. These ideas do not exist in the context of a purely materialist atheist universe. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that...
Tai, kad jis ką mėgina, kaip suprantu aš, tie argumentai, kad kadangi nėra kaip gamtoj rasti pavyzdžių, kur tu galėtume apibrėžti, ar kaip įrodyti, tarkim, laisvą valią determinizmo argumentai spręsti, tai jis naudoja tą stoką, tarsi jo argumento stiprinimui, kas jau yra ta irgi klaida God of Gaps. Ir kad tipo, kad į tam tikrą moralinį ar etinį klausimą nėra kaip objektyviai atsakyti taip arba ne, tai ateisto ta delusion pagal jį yra, tas įrodo, ant kiek jie yra delusional. Nes kita vertus, tai religija labai aiškiai pasiūlo konkrečias vertybės ir tos atsakymus. Kas yra man tragiškai nelogiška. Jeigu tu kažkokį labai komplikuotą moralinį klausimą filosofuoji 5 valandas ir tiesiog vis tiek negali konkrečiai sakyti taip arba ne. Tu gali pasakyti, nežinau. Tu gali mėginti aprašyti kiek įmanoma, išmąstyti kiek įmanoma logiškesnį variantą, ar ten kokį įstatymą, ko įmanoma logiškesnį. Ir kažkada galbūt atsitiks tas šansas, kur bus toks atvejis, kur turėsit nuspręsti, kaip pritaikot, ar atleidžiat, ar netleidžiat tuo atveju, ir kaip konkrečiai jis pažeidė, ar kažką nepažeidė. Bet turėt naglumo tiek ir savo tikinčiojo delusion, kad sakyt, va, jūs neturit konkretaus atsakymo su savo filosofijom į tą sudėtingą klausimą, tai aš tada atsakau, kad religija yra geriau, nes turi konkretų atsakymą, man yra ant tiek nesąmonė. Aš tikiuosi aiškiai pasakiau savo mintį.
That I can prove that it's God who's behind those things, because one of the...
Kaip sakai?
I'm not going to make the claim that I can prove that it's God who's behind those things.
Bet tu tiki, Tom.
One of the principles of faith belief is that I don't understand God. So...
You have no proof. Tai nedarysiu klaimo, kad Dievas yra už to, ko jūs negalite rodyti su savo mąstymu ir logika ir filosofija. Bet aš tikėsiu tom. Tai įrodymų tam nereikia. Ridiculous.
For people who don't believe in God, that's an easy way out, right? That's an easy way out for people like me, because I say, well, I don't have to explain the relationship between God and free will, because frankly, I don't fully understand God. But that's not really that's not really an open window. That's just part of pretty much all faith systems, is that if my mind were the mind of God, then I would either be God or God would not exist, one of the two things. So the idea that reason makes a difference in our lives, that we can reason our way to propositions, and that's more than just saying a few magic words and that's setting off a few neurons in somebody else's brain in a naturalistic way, that there actually is principles of truth, another concept that comes from the extra-natural world, that these principles exist. So far I've mentioned free will, good, right and wrong, reason, and truth, right? All things that we consider extremely key in our daily lives, and that Alex considers key in what he does. It's, I assume, why you get up every morning, or at least why you feel you get up every morning. You know, what gets you up to do your podcast? It's because you want to say things that you believe are reasonable, are going to convince people to act in a better way, or I assume not a worse way, that get people to change their lives in some way, in a self-motivated fashion. That's not merely in a sort of Pavlovian response to circumstance and environment. So if I were going to talk about the atheist delusion, that's what I would suggest is the delusion, that an atheist can use terminology that is drawn from a world that is external to atheism for itself. And
Blet, viskas yra klaidinga. Jis, blet, kiek jis daug dalykų sujungia. Pasiema tarsi iš čia gerą idėją, iš ateistų, tarsi iš čia ir viską pasiema savo. Kai realiai tie dalykai negali egzistuoti tavo tikėjime. Kai jis daro tokias, blet, jis tiek daug pasakė, čia reiktų užrašyti ir stebė, čia yra tiek daug pasakyta.
A sort of Pavlovian response to circumstance and environment. So if I were going to talk about the atheist delusion, that's what I would suggest is the delusion, that an atheist can use terminology that is drawn from a world that is external to atheism for it.
Kad ateistai, pavyzdžiui, paima dalykus, kaip ten, kuris kalbėjo free will ar dar kažką, ko negali rodyti, bet nepamini, kad ateistas to vietoj pasakytų žodį, kurio tu nieko nepasakysi, tipo, tikėjime, nežinau. Ir lauksim daugiau duomenų, kad nereiktų tikėti belenkuom. Ir gal mes galim atsakyti vieną dieną, gal neatsakysim, į daugumą tų klausimų per 1000 metų atsakėm, bet tas ateistas, jis sakė, nežinau, kai nežinojo. Tarpu Ben Shapiro, su savo tikėjimu ir panašiai, jūs negalite atsakymą, žinot, jūs delusional. Bet pala, tu irgi atsakymą nežinai, bet tu teigi, kad žinai atsakymą ir turi tos atsakymus, arba bent jau galvoji, kad jie yra geresni, stipresni, svaresni, kai nėra jokio įrodymo tam. Ir jis vadina juos delusional, kai tu literaliai apibūdini, kad tu esi delusional šitos savo opening statementų. Ir by the way, čia yra tragiškas opening statementas. Labai padrikos mintis, žiauriai nestruktūrizuota. Aš nežinau, kaip atsakyti tokį kratinį tiesiog. I guess tu konkrečiai nesakysi kratinį dabar, ką Aleksas turėtų daryti, tai savo pasaulėžiūrą papasakot, kuri hopefully pasirodytų kaip tikslesnė gal negu šito ramblinimas.
Itself. And again, that's not an argument for God even. That's just an argument against atheism. Again, I think the arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I've said to Sam Harris. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well, something
atheists tend to be more religious. I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God.
Visiškai neteisybė. Kad dar kartą, kaip
people who believe in God have expressed doubts.
Tie, kurie tiki Dievu, išreiškia dvejonės.
A lot of people who are atheists tend to be more
o daug žmonių, kurie yra ateistai,
religious in this way than many of the people.
Taip užtikrintai tarsi, yra įstikinę kažkuo, kad jie vos nelabiau kaip tie religinė. Čia yra visų pirma labai miela, kad religinių žmonės apibūdino visus maždaug, kaip jis pasakė, kurį žodį. Most people, dauguma, kurie tiki, jie dvejoja.
Yeah, a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well,
are fairly God even. That's just an argument against atheism. Again, I think the arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I've said to Sam Harris. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have
most people who believe in God, dauguma žmonių, kurie tiki,
expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists.
Bet tada kitoj pusėj a lot of, daug. Ir čia jau šitą dekonstruojant jau yra klaida. Jeigu tu prieisi, lyginsi, pavyzdžiui, 2 grupės žmonių. Ir vienoje grupėje yra štuka žmonių, ir kitoje yra štuka žmonių. Dabar ateistai ir religingi žmonės, ne? Ir tu sakai, dauguma religingų žmonių turi klausimų ir dvejoja. Bet daug ateistų yra tiesiog fanatikai, kurie nedvejoja. Reiškia, religiniai žmonės yra geri. Bet pala, tu tik ką pasakai dauguma. Bet šitoj pusėj daug. Kas yra daug? Kas yra daug? Vienam gali būti 15 žmonių daug. Ar tu, ir jeigu po štuką žmonių grupė yra, tu dabar 500 sulyginai su spektru galimai arba 5 žmonės, arba 10, arba 30, arba 900. Bet tai, jeigu jų irgi būtų dauguma, tu būtum sakęs dauguma, bet jų nėra dauguma. Ir dabar, va, tas sulyginimas, bet vėlgi, čia toks mielas triukas, kurį žmonės daro. Ok, besides the point, bet dabar pats argumentas, kad vieni, gerai, tiek religingi žmonės, tiek nereligingi žmonės, ateistai, gali būti ekstremalūs savo dalykai. Ir aš nekenčiu abiejų. Ir aš šitoje vietoje pritarčiau minčiai, kad daug visai žmonių, kurie šiaip dievų netiki, jie tikės tokiais absurdais, kad, net, galėsi sulyginti su didžiausiais ten fanatikais. Bet statistiškai kalbant tikrai, tie, kurie tikėjimų užsiema, jų daug daugiau bus radikalesnių pozicijų arba niekuo neparemtų pozicijų, nes pas juos yra tas tikėjimas ir tikėjimu vadovaujas. Tai čia visiškai nesąmonė teiginys. Bet jo, aš todėl gal ir sakau dažniausiai žmonėm, kad, pavyzdžiui, kai mes apie Rusiją ir Ukrainą ten šnekėjom pradžioj, kur prisimenat, kur pradžioj visi dūchino Rusą, koks jis smegenim išplautas dūchas debilas, kaip jis gali tikėti dalykais, kuriais tiki, jam smegenys išplautos ir panašiai. Tai kaip ant religingų žmonių ateistas galėtų varyti, ne? Bet tada tu pasižiūri tą lietuvį ir jis visiškai aklai tikėjo visiškai kliedesiais apie tą Ghost of Kiev ir visom istorijom kitom. Be jokio kritinio mąstymo, be nieko. Mano akis aš ir sakau, tu dabar esi teisus, nes tau pasisekė ir viskas. Tu neturi jokio minčių proceso, tai tu, kad atsirinkti tą, kad nepasiduoti propagandą ir patikrinti informaciją. Jeigu tu būtum Rusijai, tu lygiai to pačiu dalyku tikėtum, ką tas Rusas, kurį tu duchini. Ir va, tai, ką Ben Shapiro čia bando pasakyti, kad ir kam dalinai pritariu, kad jo, realiai daug žmonių, tiek ateistai, tiek tikintieji, neturi jokio to gerai apgalvoto, tarkim, ar kritinio mąstymo, ar loginio mąstymo, kaip vertinti duomenis ar kažką. Ir jie sakys, o aš dievų netikiu, bet tikės 150 kitų nesąmonių. Bet tai visiškai niekuom nepagrindžia ar nepastiprina argumento, kad religija yra visų pirma naudinga visuomeniai arba kad religija yra geresnis kažkuom negu ateizmas ar kažką, tai neturi įtakos. Aš sakyčiau, priešingai yra. Jeigu tu remiesi mokslu, galbūt jo iki galo nesupranti, bet remiesi mokslu, tu statistiškai bus tiesiog teisesnis daugiau argumentų negu religingas žmogus, kuris remiasi tikėjimu. Bet, čia, jei iki to gal dėjus, man įdomu, ką Aleksas sakys. Bet jo, viską, ką Benas pasakė, realiai gal ne viską, bet tarkim 9% aš prieštaraučiau iš karto ir reiktų išrašyti žodis po žodį ir kabinėtis absurdiškai prie daug dalykų čia galima. Nes labai daug dalykų tiesiog nesurištų, nelogiškų pasakyta, bet tai yra protingas žmogus, by the way. Bet aš sakau, religija neturi gerų argumentų. Tu negali loginių argumentų daryti už religiją. Tu gali keletą, tarkim, bet čia, kai tu taip sujunginėjai dalykus ir tiek daug prielaidų darai, netgi prielaida kai jis apie tą žmogų, apie Aleksą kalbėjo, kad, tu nori pakeisti kitų nuomonę ir kai jie pakeis savo gyvenimus, tu nežinai to. Gal aš to nežinau, gal Shapiro tą žino, bet tokios prielaidos daromas. Anyway.
Tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well,
o žinot, ką aš tavo dėdį pasakyčiau? Chilbib Kaski?
Well, something's certain. We don't do cold opens or soft starts here on the big conversation. Alex?
Well, I am glad to begin on a point of agreement with you, Ben, that yes, if there is no God, there is no free will, but I think that's because of the truth of the latter of those statements. That I suppose the biggest criticism that I made of you in a video response that I made to the atheist delusion, and this show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
By the way, I should say it's a great video, and everybody should watch it if they haven't.
Well, I'm going to put that in the description. I think that glowing endorsement. The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle, or not so subtle, implication in my view that yes, with no God there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to to either say that there is free will. In order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God, and that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now you can call that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible. So I know that the way you solve that is that you say that there is no free will.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
Tema laisvos valios ir determinizmo yra įdomi ir mes neturime jai atsakymų. Bet tai nereiškia, kad ir mums reikia pradėti tikėti Dievu. Yra filosofiniai visai geri, man atrodo, paaiškinimai, kur bando paaiškinti, tarsim, gal tai yra didesnė problema žodžiuose, kuriuos mes vartojam ir kaip mes suprantam laisvą valią, ir mūsų sukurtuose žodžiuose yra problema, kad mes neturim žodžių apibūdinti konceptų tam tikrų. Man tas visai patiko paaiškinimas, bet aš čia blogai vis tiek perfrazuoju. Bet vėlgi, taip kaip mes suprant pasaulį, jo yra labai sunku padaryti argumentą, kad laisva valia egzistuoja. Bet šitoj vietoj mes susidarėm su problema, kaip mes suprantam žodžius laisva valia. Nes visiems praktiniam tikslam, visiems mums praktiniam gyvenime kasdienybėje tikslams, mes turim laisvą valią. Gal jeigu, kai tu pradedi gilintis, tipo, viską gali atsekti kaip pirmojo atomo ir anksčiau iki kažkur, kad tipo, viskas kaip ir nulemta, tai tu techniškai gal ir neturi, bet visiems praktiniam tikslam turi. Tai tas, bet mes neturim atsakymo gero tam. Bet Dievo prie čia iš vis nereikia. Niekam nereikia Dievo. Vėlgi, tu tiesiog gali pasakyti nežinom atsakymą. And that's it. Gal vien ten žinosim, gal filosofiškai kažkaip turėsim daug geresnį argumentaciją, bet nežinau, čia įmanoma kažkaip atsakyti tą klausimą. Kaip ir, kas sukūrė visatą Dievas, gerai, kas sukūrė Dievą. Tu visą laiką galėsi užduoti ekstra klausimą, kurį neturėsi atsakymo. Tai tas determinizmas ir, bet ta daryta prielaida ir ką Aleksas gerai čia pointautina, kad prie ko čia Dievas? Kodėl reikia Dievo būtent? Kodėl reikia nežinojimui Dievo? Kodėl tos dobes nežinojimą reikia užpildyti Dievu?
That way.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I suppose that I'm just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will. I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will. And that you are essentially just a biological machine reacting to its internal and evolutionary drives. That's what's happening. Now, call that nihilistic if you like, that's a separate question, but as to the question of how this would make one act, the idea that this might cause us to sort of lay around in bed...
Tai Aleksas netiki, kad laisva valia yra, tipo, jo pozicija, kaip aš supratau, čia taip ir pasakė, kai jis... Kas yra logiška pozicija, greičiausiai, aš irgi greičiausiai įlinkčiau į tą pusę, jeigu reiktų taip sakyti, bet vėlgi, we have no idea. Bet tam pasaulyje žiūroj, be tikėjimo, realiai visi įrodymai, visa logika rodo į tą, kad neturėtų tada būti laisvos valios kaip koncepto.
Something. The very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning. Why do you get out of bed and go and make your breakfast if there's no free will? So you go and get breakfast because there's no free will and something is driving you to do that. That's outside of your control.
For sure. So to get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven by evolutionary biology and environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life. Maybe again, I'm drawing from a realm that is not evolutionarily biologically connected. The word purpose is really, teleology obviously has been taken out of the realm of science pretty thoroughly by atheists and by many people in the sciences, although I would argue that, again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when they're describing functions of particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to keep you alive, right? They're constantly using language that's teleological in nature. The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to do. So you say, well, it's biology that drives you to get out of bed in the morning, which is almost Calvinist in sort of the way that it's described, right? It's like you're predestined to get out of bed in the morning, so thus you get out of bed in the morning. But the reality is that we are constantly making decisions as though those decisions make a difference in the universe. And what social science actually does tend to show is that when people believe that they have control over their own actions, then when they believe that they're capable of changing the way that they live, they do make those changes with more alacrity and in better direction.
Čia aš net ginčiausi, ar tikrai žmonės daro tos pakeitimus. Man atrodo, daugiau žmonių nelabai daro tų pakeitimų. Kai kurie daro, bet nežinau, jo, čia tas argumentas. Jo, mes dabar galim ginčytis, ar laisva valia egzistuoja ar ne, ar viskas nulemta. Beno Shapiro pagrindinis argumentas, kad visuomenė nustoja egzistuoti, jeigu žmogus neturi laisvos valios. Arba bent jau, neįsivaizduoja, kad turi laisvą valią, tipo. Ir kas, jo, gal būtų neblogas argumentas, jeigu tu tada pasiūlytum tikėjimą kaip išeiti, kas yra smegenų nuodas ir turi tada daug problemų. Jeigu Ben Shapiro teiginys yra, kad tikėjimas laisva valia yra žudbūt visuomenė reikalingas, kad normali visuomenė būtų, tada aš sakyčiau, okei. O tipo, determinizmas tas ir, netikėjimas laisva valia kenktų visuomenė, aš sakyčiau tada gerai, bet tikėjimas pats dar labiau kenktų visuomenė, net negu neturėjimas tos laisvos valios koncepto. O tuo tarpu laisvos valios konceptą visiems praktiniam tikslam žmonės gyvena tarsi turėtų, nes visais praktiniais tikslais mes ir turim. Dabar jeigu mes norim ginčytis ir ieškoti tikrą atsakymą, ar egzistuoja, mes galim, bet tai realiai praktinio gyvenimo neįtakoja. Lygiai taip pat, kad mes galim kalbėti paras apie juodasias skyles ir panašiai, praktiniam gyvenime visiškai nieko mums nenulėmė tas. Galim ginčytis, kas techniškai nulėmė, nes juodosios skylės galaktikos centre ir viskas juda aplinkui ir panašiai, bet praktiniam žmogaus gyvenime tai visiškai neturi jokios įtakos. Tai tas Ben argumentas man čia tiesiog yra žiauriai silpnas. Maždaug, tau atrodo taip, okei, man taip netrodo, bet tu rėmės tikėjimo, aš nesirėmiu tikėjimo, aš automatiškai by default nugaliu, nes tu rėmės dalykų, kuriam neturi įrodymo, aš bent jau sakau, tada nežinau, bet jo.
Then if they don't believe that, if people tend to believe in a deterministic universe, they do act worse. So it may work, this is going to be sort of Straussian in its implications, but that may work for you. You're a very high IQ individual who can somehow reconcile the idea of living a very purposeful life with the idea that actually there's no purpose to anything. But for the vast majority of people, that is not actually how they live. And I would suggest that even in your daily life, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, man, my biology is driving me this morning to get on the bike, have a great day, the sun is shining, that's my biology doing this. And I don't think that most people who live purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that, I mean, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, look at my biological
My neurons are firing, yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then the whole evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps the implications that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case.
Įdomus argumentas, aš to nesu girdėjęs. Aš čia daug ko nesu girdėjęs, jų argumentų, bet jeigu Ben Shapiro ginčės, kad žudbūt reikia tikėjimo, kad žmogus turėtų laisvą valią, nes kitaip atsikelia ir išprotėjęs tu būsi, Bet jo, Aleksas realiai apeliuoja į evoliuciją. Pala, ne. Tokie žmonės ir neišgyveno. Ir evoliucija, va, tas procesas buvo labai nuostabus, kuris padarė mūsų smegenyse labai daug tokių blokų ar apsaugų, kad tu galėtum egzistuoti ir funkcionuoti ir neišprotėtum. Jo, tam jokios religijos nereikia ir jokio tikėjimo to labiau. Mes turim labai daug visokių smegenyse procesų, kurie mus apsaugo ten. Kai kurie gan blogi, kai kurie gan geri, bet evoliucija, tai padaro, kad mes išgyventumėm, kad mes galėtumėm funkcionuoti ir išgyventumėm. Realiai čia labai gražiai nurašo Shapiro net argumentą, kad mums žudbūt reikia kažkokio external tikėjimo, kad mes galėtumėm funkcionuoti. Ne, evoliucija tom labai elegantiškai pasirūpino. Čia yra geras. Damn. Ar Ben Shapiro turėsi tai ką pasakyti?
That free will doesn't exist. And we may feel very... I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case that free will doesn't exist. And we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings. And I will say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research. Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic, the proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational precepts of philosophy, we can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity, and this will be regardless of whether it's material or immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, a pertinent one, is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind, or inside your brain, or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? So indeterminate, it's random. Determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this, they say, well, look, with a religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul.
Daug solidesnis argumentas iš loginės pusės. Tas turbūt man visą laiką ir bus kirvis su tikėjimais ir religija, kad kokį tu argumentą bestatytum, jie yra nešvarūs. Reikalauja arba kažkokios prielaidos, kurį tu nežinai, arba nelogiška. Bet tada tu, jeigu konstruoji loginį argumentą, jis yra tobulai logiškas. Tu negali išrinkti kažkaip. Negali paimti vieną dalyką ir prie jo prisipės. Gali, bet gali prie visko pasakyti, ne, tu klysti pasakyti, bet racionaliai negali. Ir tu niekur kitur, jeigu paimsi jo argumentus, kurie iš logiškai sustatyti, tu niekur nepritaikysi juos priešingai kažkaip. Ar kažkur kitoj situacijoje nepritaikysi, kad parodyt, kad čia yra priešprieša kažkokia. Niekad taip nebus. Nes logika neapnuginčiama. Tą vadinam logiką. Bet kita vertus Shapiro argumentą, gerai, šitoj vietoj, okei, bet dabar jeigu apie kitą dalyką šnekėsim ir tos argumentus, kuriuos tu pasakei, mes ten jau nebegalim taikyti, arba juos turim biškiuką pakeisti, kad tiktų ir ten. Ir čia man yra problema. Su to tikėjimu religija man visą laiką čia yra problema. Su nelogiškai žmonėm yra problema, kai tu sakai, kad tu laikaisi vieno ar kito požiūrio, bet jį kaitalioji pagal situaciją. Vienam hipotetiniam tu kitaip taikai, kitam dar kitaip, tai tu neturi tos vertybės, tu neturi tos pozicijos. Tiesiog tu improvizuoji as you go. Ir man tokie dalykai niekad nepatiko. Tai jo, dabar Aleksas kaip sudėliojo argumentą iš loginės pusės, jis yra flawless. Ir dabar kas tikinčiam žmogui belieka, aš taip nemanau, I guess.
Solve anything. Because you still need to, it's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery. But if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Well,
Tai čia buvo labai geras argumentas, kad laisva valia neegzistuoja. Aš kitais žodžiais tą papasakoju tipo žmonėm, kaip ir su Pavelu, kai šnekėjom, kad realiai, pasakyk bent vieną random veiksmą, kurį tu atsitiktinį manai, kad atlieki. Ir ten tas, užsimaniau šiandien, dabar užsimaniau kebabų ir nusipirkau. Bet tada gerai. Kokia buvo priežastis ir tu visą laiką eini, kol galų gale daini atomai. Taip judėjo ir tai buvo nulemta. Nes užsimaniau kebabą, gerai. Kas reiškia užsimaniau kebabą? Dabar mes žinom iš mokslinės pusės, kad mūsų organizme yra ta, kaip ten gut flora, nepamenu, kaip ten išsiverčia jinai, kur auga tarsi ekosistema iš bakterijų sudaryta, tarkim, taip perfrazuoti, kur ką tu valgai, tu pripratini prie tam tikrų maistų ir panašiai, ir ta flora, ta bio diktuoja smegenim signalus siunčia, ko tau norėti, ko tau kreivinti, kartais užsimaniai kažko. Kartais moteris užsimano kažko suraus. Gal dėl vienos priežasties, gal nėščios, gal ten mėnesinės dar kažkas. Atrodo, užsimaniau. Tam yra priežastis. Smegenis tau pasakė, kad tu to užsimaniai, nes jos tą kontroliuoja. Kas pasiuntė signalą? Kažkuris organas. Lengviausia, nes, man atrodo, moteris tos kreivinimus dažniausiai jaučia, kai nėšios būna, nežinau, bet jo, žmonėm, taip veikia visiems. Lengviausias gal pavyzdys buvo, bet kur, jo, ką reiškia tas užsimaniau kažko. Žmonėm atrodo, užsimaniau random, bet tai nėra random. Realiai tu gali savo tą gut florą pripratinti veganiškui maistui, kad tu užsimanysi veganiško maisto. Tiek cravings, žolė, kur parūko žmonės, ten cravina kokių ten saldumynų, I don't know, ten whatever. Bet esmė, kad žmonės galvoja, kad random atsitiktinės, o čia laisva valia. Ne. Šičia yra viskas nulemta. Ir, aš iš kitos pusės tą paaiškinu, realiai iš tos labiau pusės. Lengviau, man atrodo, žmonėms suprasti, nes jis labai sudėtingai tą paaiškino. Bet lygiai tą patį konceptą. Kad tu klausi to klausimo ir prieisi prie vienintelės išvados, logika diktuoja, rodo, kad laisva valia neegzistuoja. Aš jam visiškai pritariu čia. Ir tai yra logiška pozicija. Jeigu tu logika remsies ir logiškai dėlios argumentus, rodo į tą poziciją. Bet vėl, nereikia pamiršti, kad tai yra filosofinis klausimas ir mes gali pas mus nebūti tam tikros informacijos, kuri padėtų gal išspręsti tą kažkaip kitaip, bet pati logika yra neprikaištinga šitoje vietoje.
That argument does rely on the complete deconstruction of the self. I mean, you're using the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components as though the self is a computer. Right? As though if you took the self and you broke it down into a machine, and there's like there's the microchip, and you've got the processor, you've got all these different parts of it. So it has to be coming from here, or it has to be coming from here. But I think the very idea that we have of ourselves as selves is as a deciding being. And so the attempt to carve that down into, so which parts of the deciding being...
Ar turi bent vieną įrodymą šitam Benny Boy? Tai jis atsakė Alekso argumentą ne kažkokiu racionaliu būdu, bet kai tu kalbė apie self, tą kai jis kalba, kad iš savęs tai ne. Tai aš manau, kad self yra visuma kažko, kažkur, kažkaip, kažkokių įrodymų kažkam turi. Nes kad mes sudaryti iš organų skirtingų, mes turime įrodymų. Pjausto žmonės, mes mapinę visą, what the fuck. Bet tada, kad Beno argumentas veiktų, mums reikia tikėti, kad tie organai mus sudaro, bet tada dar kažkas ekstra. Siela, dar kažkas mistiško, magiško, nepaaiškinamo, neapibrėžiamo, nepamatuojamo, dar kažkas to egzistuoja. Ir tada, jeigu tas yra ir tuo mes patikim, tada mes galim paaiškinti ir paneigti Alekso puikiai logiškai išdėliotą antilaisvos valios argumentą. Ir ko tikėjimas reikalauja. Jis reikalauja tokių dalykų, tu tiesiog tikėtum be jokių įrodymų ir tada galėtum argumentą dėlioti. I fucking hate it.
That is an avoidance strategy. So I don't think that the argument quite holds.
Well, if we can call the self just a deciding being, then that sort of fundamental assumption that we make about the nature of the self, I don't think is going to be incompatible with atheism.
How so?
Because we're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms, as you've described. I see that your view of the self is an atheist view of the self, a meatball wandering through space, as I've put it somewhat colorfully, the sort of Spinoza idea that you're a stone that's been thrown, and you can comprehend that you've been thrown, but you're a stone that's been thrown, and that's just the way that it is. Why would there be in atheist philosophy such a thing as a deciding self? The deciding being, is external to the idea of an evolutionary cause, because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision-making. And you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
Uncaused decision-making, I suppose, is a concept that I think is unintelligible. And therefore, if there is an unintelligibility of the self on atheism, I suppose the thrust of the criticism that I made to essentially every point you made in that video, except for the argument from motion, is that what you're saying to me, if it applies to atheism, I think simultaneously applies to theism as well.
How so?
An uncaused decision. I mean, what is the process by which a decision is made?
But now you're falling into the same sort of argument that I excluded at the beginning, which was, I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand.
Tai tau nereikia tada gilintis? Nesuprantu ir viskas? That's the beauty. Čia yra horror of religion, o ne beauty of religion. Dabar uždavė tada gerą klausimą. Gerai, jeigu Benny Boy mūsų nori sakyti, kad self negali egzistuoti pas ateistą kaip konceptas, nes ateistas turi galvoti, kad viskas turyta iš organų, kurie nesusiję tarpusavį, ir kaip tu gali paaiškinti self, ar kad jie kartu turi veikti, kad sukurti kažką self. Aš laisvai tą galėčiau jaučiu paaiškinti kaip. Nes yra dependency, vienas organas nuo kito ir visa visuma, ir tu tą gali vadinti self laisvai. Bet tada Benny jam uždavė klausimą. Gerai, pasigilinam tada. Nesigilinam, aš nežinau. What?
So, at the beginning.
Is made.
But now you're falling into the same sort of argument that I excluded at the beginning, which was, I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand. So I can't explain to you how the uncaused self makes decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
framework. But you have
framework.
a burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that reasonable materialist.
You're the one who's claiming. Kas čia daro claimą? Kieno įrodymų kartelę turi? Benny daro claimą, kad tavo self turi būti external kažkoks mistinis dalykas, kad tu galėtum turėti konceptą self. Čia yra tavo claimas. Tu turi tą įrodyti, o ne Aleksas. Aleksas visiškai teisus. Jis claimo tokio nedarė. Pagal jį tada kaip tik gali tada sakyti, kad mes sudaryti iš daug organų, tai yra mūsų self. Ką mes galim pamatuoti, Benas teigia, kad yra ne tik tie mūsų pavieniai organai, tarkim, tie detalės, bet dar ir kažkas mistiško papildomo.
Universe is the cause of all. And so, if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. The simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
framework. But you have
framework.
a burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And so, if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said at the very beginning, that leaves me a giant escape hatch. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch. It also tends to act as a fundamental principle of faith, right? Again, in every moral realm, right? When we get to the problem of good and evil, right? One of the big questions is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's, which is a giant escape hatch. It also happens to be true from a religious point of view.
So if I may,
Kol kas labai daug girdžiu iš Beno, tiesiog religija yra zaibys, nes jinai duoda, kaip čia, duoda tau pabėgimą nuo sunkių klausimų. Nuostabu. Čia yra man didžiausias minusas religijos, kokį tu gali pasakyti, bet jis mato kaip pliusą. kai yra užduodami sunkus klausimai, arba klausimai, kuriuos mes neturim atsakymų, religija taigi duoda mums paaiškinimą. Tai yra, mes nežinom ir religija, ir tikėjimas, ir viskas, ir mums nereikia net galvoti apie tai, ir jūs išgelbėti. Kas čia per nesąmonė? What the fuck? Ir kaip Benas gali tokius dalykus sakyti, ir jam tipo tinka, nežinot dalykų ir tada net nekalbėti apie juos, nes, man duoda exitą, aš jį paimsiu. Ir tau nėra smalsu tada iš tikro, tada gilinamtis toliau ir mėginti atsakyti tos klausimus. Ir kai tu daini tą tašką nežinau, jau pasakyti, okei, mes nežinom. Ne, jam reikia užpildyti tą religiją ir tada sakyti, kai verčia išnekėti apie tai, aš nenoriu apie tai išnekėti, man religija duoda escape'ą ir aš jį pasiemu ir man nereikia apie tai galvoti. Čia yra tas smegenų nuodas, apie ką aš ir kalbu. Kai tu tokiais tikėjimu remiesi ir tikėjimas tave užvaldęs yra. Kaip reasoningas, kaip, sudėtingas klausimas, aš turiu patogų išėjimą ir aš išeisiu net nebegalvosiu apie tai, nes man per sudėtinga.
There are two sort of escape hatches here. There are two appeals to mystery going on here. And it seems to me that what you're saying...
An escape hatch. It also happens to be true from a religious point of view.
So if I may, that there are two sort of escape hatches here. There are two appeals to mystery going on here. And it seems to me that what you're saying is something along the lines of my simple appeal to mystery here is disallowed in the way that you're allowed to appeal to this mystery because I'm the one making the claim. I think that not
because I'm the one making the claim, but because
I'm the one with the burden. In the context of this discussion,
I'm missing the who's the you and who's the I in a sense, but yes.
I see what you mean. I'm speaking for myself there.
Sorry.
If in the context of this discussion, this began the subject which I think is the first one you bring up in this video, free will. Here's this thing that I think exists, and on the basis of its existence, think entails the existence of a God, or at least points to the existence of a God. I shouldn't say entail. And then when I say that I don't think that the concept of free will is intelligible, and you say, well, how is it intelligible on atheism? And I say, I'm not sure it is, but it's not on theism either. And you say, well, there's my escape hatch. I can appeal to mystery.
True.
I don't think the burden is on me there. I think you were the one who's making the claim that free will does exist. That there is this mysterious property of the universe
actually, that's
escapes this determined or indetermined dichotomy. And then when I say that this is unintelligible to me and based on what I see to be fundamentally appeal.
Čia toks iš kitos pusės, jeigu viena pusė sako, laisva valia egzistuoja ir turi egzistuoti. Gerai, bet mes dar nenustatėm, kad neegzistuoja. Ir tu dabar sakai, kad Aleksas, pavyzdžiui, sako, nėra įrodymų, arba kaip tik yra priešingi įrodymai, kad neegzistuoja, kad jisai klaimą daro, bet ne, tu klaimą padarai, kad egzistuoja ir turi egzistuoti. Tai
Appeal to a law of logic. Suddenly I'm the one making the claim. I'm the one with the burden who has to... No, the actual claim that I originally made, if you recall, was a conditional claim. I did not claim free will exists, therefore God. I claimed if you believe free will exists, it cannot exist in a materialist universe. Now, you say, okay, fine, it doesn't exist in a materialist universe. I don't believe in free will.
Yes.
That's fine. That's totally plausible. As I said right at the top here, I'm not going to prove to you that God exists today. What I am going to say is that the vast majority of people throughout nearly all of human history have believed there is a thing called a self. It is a deciding self that makes these decisions. If you are a person who believes that...
Benas tik klaidą padarė loginę, tą, kur mes žiūrėjom, appeal to history, ne, appeal to, kaip ten tas buvo, į tradiciją. Maždaug, kadangi žmonės per visą istoriją tikėjo į self, reiškia, tai turi būti teisinga. Iš literaliai tą klaidą padarė.
There is a thing called a self. It is, I'm going to say, is that the vast majority of people throughout nearly all of human history have believed there is a thing called a self. It is a deciding self that makes these decisions. If you are a person who believes that, you're right. It can't exist in your world. So I'm not saying that it does exist. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're totally right. And all of this is just a series of chemical firings. That's quite plausible. That's fine. What I have said, and this is the argument that hasn't yet been rebutted, is that society does require an extraordinary number of people to believe that they are capable of making decisions for the good or for the bad. Because, again, not everybody is you. Not everybody is capable of waking up in the morning, putting one half of their brain on hold.
Yeah, but side that says, what I'm doing today doesn't matter,
and we are all going to wind up in the cosmic nothingness of space anyway, and the sun's going to explode and eat the Earth. Most people don't function that way. And so a functional society, a society that actually works, relies on people actually believing that their fate is...
I don't agree. It doesn't rely on people actually believing. Ir kaip ir Aleksas tam nepritarė. Ir čia vat jis sako tą prielaidą tokia, kuri tarsi teisinga, bet ji nėra teisinga, aš nesutinku su tom. Ir Aleksas turėjo labai gerą atsakymą, evoliucija realiai padaro smegenis taip, kad mums nereikėtų to, kad laisvai gali funkcionuoti, nes vėlgi praktiniam tikslams mums nesvarbu, juodoji skylė radijuoja savo ten energiją kažkur už 1000 milijardų šviesmečių ar ne, kol tai yra teisybė ir faktas, mums tai neįtakoja, kaip lygiai taip pat šičia. Laisva valia neegzistuoja, sure, kiek žmonių apie tai mąsto ir galvoja. Praktiniams tikslams niekas apie tą nemąsto ir negalvoja. Ir jo elgesį gyvena tarsi turėtų, nes kaip tu kitaip darys, nes praktiniams tikslams mūsų evoliucinės smegenys labai gražiai tą sutvarkė. Ką tu prašai? Bet vėl tai, jei Dievas tave valdo ir viskas nulemta, tai tada nėra laisvos valios, nes viskas, ką tu darai, buvo nuspręsta Dievo. Tu sakai, kad jį... Nu jo, jeigu visi mes pagal Dievo planą gyvenam, tai jo, ar mes tikrai turim laisvą valią? Ne, bet matai, tada jis gali sakyti, ne, man Dievas pasakė, kad žmogus turi laisvą valią. Jisai sukūrė pradinį ir dabar mums davė laisvą valią. Tai kadangi tam nereikia įrodymų, nes yra tikėjimas, tai gali tiesiog tą pasakyti ir valio. Neturi jokių įrodymų, kad turi laisvą valią, nes tau Dievas taip pasakė, bet welcome to religion, I guess.
In their hands. And the way that people tend to understand that on a day-to-day level is, I get up in the morning and I make a decision whether I'm taking my kids to school today. I get up in the morning and I decide whether I'm giving charity today. I get up in the morning and I decide whether to go to a job today. Because the truth is that for a huge number of people, and I would say this is true for not virtually all, many, I would say the majority of people, if they were informed since the time they were small that their decision-making process does not exist, there is no decision to be made. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Those decisions have no moral weight in the universe because the universe has no moral weight. There is no way to create a functional society on the basis of these premises. There may be a platonic world.
There absolutely is. Ir vėlgi, tu prieldi, aš nesutinku su to, kad reikia Dievo iš vis, kad žmonės negalėtų funkcionuoti, jeigu suvoktų, kad laisva valia neegzistuoja. Net jeigu rytoj išeitų tyrimas, kuris 100% įrodytų, kad laisva valia neegzistuoja ir niekad neegzistavo ir neegzistuos, visuomenė greičiausiai funkcionuotų plius minus taip pat, nes visų pirma beveik niekam nerūpėtų. Visų antra, koks skirtumas? Jeigu tu dabar padarai nusikaltimą, tu negali teisme naudoti gynybos, viskas nulemta, mėgino kažkoks ten čiuvakas, viskas nulemta, aš neturiu laisvos valios, aš privalėjau tą padaryti, nes taip nulemta buvo. Nesvarbu, mes visuomenė sudėliojom savo įstatymus, sudėliojom kaip visuomenė, kad nesvarbu, ar yra laisva valia ar ne. Mes negalim daryti tokių dalykų vien dėl to, kad, ir paskui gintis, jeigu taip jau nulemta buvo, mes tave uždarysim, nuteisim ir tu būsi išimtas iš visuomenės. Mes kaip žmonės taip sudėliojom visuomenę ir sukūrėm tą visuomenę, kurioje funkcionuojam. Kurioje beje gali funkcionuoti ir žmonės, kurie kitaip mąsto. Tuo tarpu, pagal tikėjimo visuomenėse kurtose, nelabai gali egzistuoti kita tikiai žmonės, nes juos tada jau pasirodo žudyti reikia.
Where philosophers can think about this in the gardens of their imagination and feel great about it. But that's not actually how society functions, not for children, not for teenagers, not for adults.
Yes. And we're going to go on and talk about that in the second section. I had free will to ask any of the questions I've had written down here, but I just didn't want to. I didn't want to stop either of you. It's been breathless and captivating. I'm sure you'll agree. Before we go to our first break, we are going to go on and talk about society and how morality undergirds society and civilization.
May I just say, but just I know we're coming to the end of the section. Just to close off this moment, that if people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. You know.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as an insult, but you see what I'm saying.
Yes, exactly. Kaip gerai, kai jis tą pasakė. Nes moderatorius jau nori keisti temą, tarsi abu teisūs, teisybė kažkur per vidurį. Ne. Vienas remiasi visiškai logiškų foundation, o kitam reikia, kad egzistuotų magiški dalykai, kurių negalim paaiškinti, pamatuoti. Ir tada, kai tu paklausi paaiškinimo ar to pamatavimo, man religija duoda exitą ir man nereikia to paaiškinti. Jo, kas čia remiasi fucking delusion? Tu, Benny boy.
I totally agree. And so from my argument, you would be, and from your argument, I would be. Yeah. Meaning, I think that you are delusional, there's no free will, and you think I'm delusional in the sense that there is no free will, and yet I believe in it.
Jam nereikia tikėti, tau reikia tikėti.
Before we go to the break then, because we're trying to break it down. We've got two insane minds here, really kind of grappling. And I feel as though I've won a prize in a competition just to be here sitting with you both. To break it down for the viewers, Alex, would you say that free will is maybe, if there is no such thing as free will, is it nevertheless a helpful fiction for people, a convenient narrative that we can cling to sort of bat away despair?
Precisely why it evolved, in my view. I think...
Kaip buvo suformuotas klausimas?
Grappling. And I feel as though I've won a prize in a competition just to be here sitting with you both. To break it down for the viewers, Alex, would you say that free will is maybe, if there is no such thing as free will, is it nevertheless a helpful fiction for people, a convenient narrative that we can cling to sort of bat away despair?
Precisely why it evolved, in my view. I think I totally understand that, but because it evolved so strongly, I will say that we are all, if we are sort of delusory in our belief in free will. I mean, you're quite right in saying that I act as if free will exists in the sense of not constantly being aware that it doesn't. I don't wake up and do those strange morning affirmations.
Šitas, Blet, čia yra geras sakinys.
Delusory in our belief in free will. I mean, you're quite right in saying that I act as if free will exists in the sense of not constantly being aware that it doesn't.
Mes elgiamės taip, tarsi laisva valia egzistuotų, bet tik iš tos pusės, kad mes pastoviai negalvojam, kai jinai neegzistuoja. Čia mano argumentas, tas, kur pasakoju, kad visiems praktiniais tikslais no one cares. Ir tai yra mūsų tas evoliucinis pliusas. Mes jau negalvojam apie tai. Mes nemąstom apie tai. Good.
I don't wake up and do those strange morning affirmations that you mentioned into the mirror about, you know, the sort of heat death of the universe. But,
maybe you should.
People, I think it is good to reflect on your mortality in that manner every once in a while, and it does inspire some serious thought about whether you're really taking your philosophy seriously. But I will say that the mechanism is so useful and has been so successful in embedding itself into our psyche that we cannot shake it off. So I can I can have conversations with people, as I do regularly, talking about the existence of free will, and they come away saying, you know what, that's extraordinary, maybe you're right about this. And nothing about the way they live their life changes.
Exactly. Blet, aš nežinau, arba aš esu genijus tiesiog, davai paglostom save, žinai, arba privočinu viską, nes čia yra exactly mano argumentas. Ką jisai dabar ir sako. Jūs girdite, aš neišsigalvoju. Visiems praktiniam tikslam žmonės gyvena ir jiems nerūpi tas. Tai, tu gali jiems net pasakyti, kad ir įrodyti, ir jie pritarsto ir viską, bet visiems praktiniam tikslam, it doesn't matter.
Maybe you're right about this. And nothing about the way they live their life changes. Nieks nepasikeičia. That the very argument I'm making relies on the assumption that we will still be driven by our drives. All I'm doing is identifying what's actually going on there, in my view. It doesn't actually change what happens or what the brain indeed does.
Ir kad jisai sukonstruotų šitą argumentą, jam nereikia remtis jokiais tikėjimais, nereikia turėti jokių baimių, kad tau užduos nepatogų klausimą. It's fucking flawless. Logiška ir gražu, struktūrizuota. Fuck.
Does.
So the utility argument for what you're saying about free will is that the main utility in you saying these things is for people not to believe you in the end.
We are predetermined to go to a break at this point. So we're going to continue this. You're watching and listening to the big conversation from Premier Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind. I've been joined today by Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro, and we are having a fascinating conversation about religion and whether it's good or bad for society. There's lots more to come, so we'll be back after this short break. Enjoying the conversation? Tell us who persuaded you in our survey. And if you want more from today's conversation, then register to get early access to the next show. Welcome back to the big conversation.
Geriausia aukščiausio intelekto bairiai yra pas mane chat'e, no joke.
Unbelievable. With me, your host, Andy Kind. Today, our topic is religion. Is it good or bad for society? And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. And in the first section, we basically solved the problem of free will. That's done. No one need write on that ever again. So congratulations. That's another credit for you.
Yeah, I think on the delusion point, we terminated in something like, and I know you are, but what am I?
Palauk sekundėlę. Ar... Kur aš tas lempas mačiau? Kas darė video su tom lempom background'e? Juodom. Ar Lekstutis? Jis su žvakę darė. Kas darė su lempom? Ar Saulius Gintautas gal? Kažkas tikrai darė su lempom. Ta pati turėjo stage. Nu, ne ta pati, bet... Aš žiauriai daug reaktinau jos. Lemba. Kažkas tikrai turėjo tokį, ne? Ne trečia lentyna, kiti paskelbėjimai. Blemba, gal? Trečia lentyna gal? Bet čia būtų senesnį video. Man dabar įdomu, kas turėjo tą backgroundą? Ne, aš nežinau kodėl, man įdomu. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Got 10 seconds.
Ever again. So congratulations. That's another credit for you.
Yeah, I think on the delusion point, we terminated in something like, and I know you are, but what am I?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And my dad can beat up your dads. So let's move on in this section to talking about another easily solved question, morality and its role in society. So, Alex, we started with Ben in the first section. Let's start with you. What for you makes an outcome good or bad? And feel free to...
Okay, geras klausimas. Kaip aš atsakyčiau tą klausimą? Labas, Ivosai. Nes tas klausimas jo, ar religija naudinga visuomenei, gerai, ką reiškia žodis naudinga? Kaip mes nuspręsime ar pamatuotumėm? Turėtų būti, kažkaip turbūt vertinčiau bent jau šitam kontekste. Kuo daugiau gerų outcome'ų ir kuo mažiau limitacijų žmonėm, bet galų gale į ką atsiremtų, tai pavyzdžiui konflikto sprendimas. Kaip tu gali, ar tavo pasaulėžiūra ar ideologija padeda kažkaip išspręsti konfliktus ir sugyventi su žmonėm, kurie yra kitokie ar skirtingi? Ar tavo ta pasaulėžiūra reikalauja, kad visi subscribintų tą pačią pasaulėžiūrą arba tą pačią mąstyseną, kad jūs sutartumėt? Ir kažkas tokio, nežinau kaip kitaip. Nes galų gale mes galime matuoti empiriškai kažką, kas geriau ekonomikai. Religijos atneša tiek ir tiek pinigų, tas atneša tiek ir tiek. Tikėjimas kaip konceptas, žinojimas, gal kažkaip galėtų, bet čia neįmanoma, jau čia būtų taip paskaičiuoti, bent semitiksliai. Bet galų gale net jeigu atneša pinigų, jūs vis tiek susidursi su situacija, kur turėsite išspręsti konfliktą kažkokį filosofiniu būdu. O jeigu filosofinis kažkoks būdas jums yra uždaras, nes vieni ir kiti tiki, jūs tik mečetėm ir ginklais galėsit spręsti tą konfliktą. I don't know. Kaip jie sakys įdomu.
Define things as you want. And how do we determine what is good and acceptable in society?
Here is where I may disappoint you and potentially excite Mr. Shapiro in that I don't have a good answer to that question. Okay. In that obviously attempts have been made for a long time to ground good outside of God. I must say that similarly to rehash the same theme, I think there are issues with grounding good in God as well. I don't think that removes the problem. I don't quite know what good is if it indeed exists. I'm quite suspicious of the concept. I think it might be another one of these unfortunately quite nihilistic evolutionary sort of illusions of a sort. I guess I ascribe to emotivism more than anything, which has sort of gone out of fashion in the past decade, but I think still has some truth to it in a sense. It's more of a philosophy of language than it is a philosophy of what good and bad actually is. What I do know, however, is that there are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else.
True.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those, inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend.
True. It's exactly what I said. Kaip išspręsti nesutarimą, kai ir jie negali koegzistuoti. Jesus fucking Christ, aš neprivočinu. That's exactly what I said.
And he says that he doesn't believe in God. There's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community. There's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me. Because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system, in the dictates allegedly of the creator of the universe, it's all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
So many things there and so much.
Kaip jums sekasi beje suprasti šitą tekstą, ką jie sako? Nes jie daug gerų žodžių žino angliškų ir taip kaip sakinius dėlioja, labai sudėtinga, man atrodo, būtų žmogui suprasti, apie ką jie iš tikrųjų kalba ir kokį konceptą kalba. Turi visų pirma anglų kalbą gerai žinoti ir konceptus tos būt gal girdėjus bent kartą. Jau kaip jums sekasi followint šitą pokalbį? Sėtingai sekasi? Okay. Aš mėginu gal vietom paaiškinti ar perfrazuoti, kur aš, bet gal net daugiau reiktų to daryti, nes aš followinu pokalbį. Ne viskas 100% suprantu, žinai, žodžius tam tikrus, bet mintis, man atrodo, ir kontekstą visą followinu tikrai neblogai. Galvoju, kiek to reikia versti, bet kiek čia gautus man verstų šitą. Manau, padeda religija tokiems žmonėms, kurie turi kažkokių tai problemų. Come on, patį banaliausią ir 100 kartą atkartotą teiginį. Paskui religija yra geras coping mechanizmas. Tai neįsprendžia problemos. Mes turim tas problemas žmonėms spręsti be neužnuodydami jų smegenis tikėjimu. Mes galim visas tas problemas, narkotikų, kitas problemas išspręsti per institucijas, per mokslinius institucijas kažkokias, per mediciną, per mokslą, ne per tikėjimą. Bet vienas iš tų religinių pliusų buvo, kai medicinos nebuvo ar panašiai, ar neturėjom net suvokimo, kodėl žmogus ten depresija serga ar kažko ar panašiai. Tai religija buvo visą laiką geras coping mechanizmas. True. Bet jis ateina kartu su tikėjimu, kas yra smegenų nuodas. Ir aš visiškai prieš tą esu. Bet tiek jau kartų tas pakartota, visi turi tą suprasti ir I'm getting triggered, kai aš tą skaitau. Čia toks, mes čia tiek giliai tą žiūrim ir tada tokį paviršutinį argumentą perskaitau.
That you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were going in a different direction with that last example, which I'll explain in a second. So, to start with the very beginning, obviously the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with emotivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with emotivism. But the sort of idea that there has to be...
Emotivismas. Kas exactly tai yra? Emotivism is a meta-ethical view that claims that ethical sentences do not express propositions, but emotional attitudes. Hence, it is colloquially known as the Boo theory. Jie apie šitą kalbėjo? Čia panašu. Influenced by the growth of analytic philosophy and logical positivism. In the 20th century, the theory was stated vividly by A.G. Ayer in his 1936 book Language, Truth and Logic, but its development owes more to C.G. Stevenson. Emotivism can be considered a form of non-cognitivism or expressivism. Okay. Aš turbūt, jeigu jie čia tuo remės, turbūt suprantu, kodėl Aleksas tą biškuką būtų paminėjęs, nes tu pro šitą būdą galėtum dylinti su determinizmu ir laisvos valios to nepaaiškinimu, kad tai yra vis dėlto lingvistinis labiau dalykas. Bet neskaitysiu dabar tiek giliai, klausom toliau.
There have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention. And those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is a really interesting one, if a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you? Or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? So if you are faced with these two alternatives, to kind of...
Bet tai man, visų pirma, aš nežinau atsakymą į šitą. Statistiškai, kas labiau tikėtina, ar tikintis, ar ne, čia labai priklausys nuo aplinkos ir panašiai, bet tai visiškai niekaip nepastiprina tavo argumento. Problema yra ta, kad jeigu ateis vienas turi kažkokį rekursą, kitas ne, nes jam tikėjimas leidžia viską. That's the point. Jeigu mes gyventum net visuomeniai, kur kas antras užmuštų, mes kaip visuomenė sukūrėm įstatymą, kur tas, kaip čia, savisaugos instinktas, nusprendėme sukurti toks įstatymus, kad, visi nori užmušti, bet neužmušim, nes sėsime kalėjimą arba mūsų sušaudys atgal ir panašiai ir panašiai. Tuo tarpu religija tiesiog neturi tokio diskurso. Tikėjimas yra gerai, bet jeigu kitas kitą tikėjimą turi, bet viskas subyra. Tai niekur Benas nepabėgo nuo to argumento šitą vien pasakydamas.
Remove your example one step. The question is why the man has come to kill you. I mean, that's your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill you over territory, I want to kill you over resources, I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any more
Tai kam tada reikia religijos, jeigu tu vis tiek būtum priverstas kurti ir adaptuoti savo religiją, ką pastoviai darot? Kad tai nėra užrašyta tikslus kažkas, jūs tiesiog kuriat kažką savo. Tai filosofija tą daro, mes per filosofiją tą darom. Kam tada tu tikėjimo iš vis reikia? Fuck me. Karaliau, jei įrodo religiją ir įrodo, kad visa tai tikra, kaip reaguotum. Ką reiškia įrodo religiją? Visa tai tikra, kas visa tai tikra? Čia labai kvailai parašytas, turiu meni gal, jeigu įrodytų, kad Dievas egzistuoja, tipo, tu tą norėjai pasakyti, ar ką visą įrodo ir ką reiškia įrodo religiją? Kad Dievas norėjai pasakyti, okei. Man tai nieko nepakeis, nes aš mokslu vadovaujuosi ir būtent įrodymais. Jeigu atsirastų kažkokie įrodymai, kad mes, nežinau, moksliniai tyrimai, kažkokiu būdu per mokslinį procesą įrodo, kad mus sukūrė kažkokią būtybę, kuri gali manipuliuoti, nežinau, fizikos dėsniais ir panašiai, whatever, tipo, Dievas, efektyviai Dievas. Aš tai nežinau, aš nesakau, kad nėra, aš sakau, kad yra, aš sakau, kad aš nežinau ir mes, man atrodo, nelabai galim tą žinoti. Tai kaip aš reaguočiau, kaip ir visas pasaulis, turbūt, what the fuck, čia insane būtų atradimas kažkoks. Bet jo, mano pasaulėžiūrai tam yra vietos, kaip ir bet kokiam naujiem duomenim. tada religingi žmonės, kita vertus, jie fucking išprotėtų. Jie dabar taip atrodytų, kad religingi žmonės, sakytų, mes buvom teisūs, ne, bet realiai 99% tų religingų žmonių paaiškėtų, kad jie nebuvo teisūs. Nes tik viena religija reiškia būtų buvus teisūs. Visos kitos ne. Tai čia būtų gal tik viena tada religija, kurie tikėjo labai specifinį dievą ir jis atitinktų kažkaip, tada gal būtų. Bet tada turėtumėm kitą klausimą, iš kur tas dievas atsirado. Ir vėl religingi žmonės kurs kitokias savo teorijas ir lygiai to pat nežinos. Ir jiem reikės atsakyti, kas sukūrė tą dievą ir iš kuris atsirado. Tuo tarpu aš galėsiu toliau be tikėjimo daryti, ką ir dariau. Turim įrodymų? Ne? Ok. Tai jo, tipo, man problemos nėra. Tipo, jo, mano pasaulėžiūra, kai aš nesiremiu jokiais tikėjimais, nesąmoningais, man nėra problemos. Bet, koks čia būtų scenarius ir kas turėtų, čia būtų fascinating. Čia būtų tokiu pačiu lygiu, kaip kad ateiviai atvažiuotų į žemę, tipo, ir mes pirmą kartą pamatytume roblę, pasirodo, ateiviai egzistuoja. Čia būtų tokio pačio lygio, tik, dar didesnė, grandiosinis dalykas. Okay.
That can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire purpose of religion, whether you want to ground that in evolutionary brain functionings, or whether you want to ground that in revelation, the entire purpose of religion on a utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interest and to say, here are things that I cannot do, even if they are in my interest, because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things.
Ja, tai klausimas va čia nepabėga, visiškai nepabėga jis nuo šito religija ir tikėjimas čia pralaimi šitoje vietoje. Jeigu mes visuomenę konstruojam tada, kaip ir Ben sako, čia jeigu ateina žmogus ir nori užmušti kitą, nes jam Dievas taip sakė, arba ateina žmogus ir nori užmušti kitą dėl savo intereso. Vienu atveju mes turim rekorsą, mes galim kažką daryti, pavyzdžiui, įstatymai, kuriuos mes sukuriam per filosofiją, per žmonių suvokimą, susitarimą ir visuomenių susitarimą ir panašiai. Beno atveju tai religija ir Dievas. Abiem atvejais jūs naudoja tarsi kažkokią bausmę, ir baimę arba nenorą, nes tave nubaus, bet vienas reikalauja tikėjimo ir nieko nepagrįstų, kitas yra gan gerai apmąstytas ir racionalizuotas sprendimas. Tai kam reikia Benio tikėjimo? Nes mes racionaliai ir apmąstymą galėsim pritaikyti bet kokiam įvykiui. Tarpu tikėjimas tada turės interpretuoti ir iš naujo kurti dalykus, kurie paremti tiesiog tikėjimu, ką Dievas pasakė, ir tu vėl susiduri su tą pačią problemą, kaip tada jums susigyventi su kito tikėjimo žmonėm, kurie netiki tais pačiais dalykais. Juos priversti tikėti, kaip tu gali priversti tikėti? Tuo tarpu, jeigu iš filosofinės tos moralinės pusės tie moralai atsiras, tau nereikia priversti tikėti nieko. Mes nusprendėm pagal kitus kriterijus. Pavyzdžiui, taip geriau visiems ir tau ir man kaip individui tai yra geriau, todėl mes racionaliu būdu priemam, kad toks turėtų būti įstatymas. O ne, Dievas tai pasakė ir jeigu to nedarysi, nubaus. Jam Dievas to nepasakė, tai tu dabar jį priversti tikėti tuo, kad tu tiki, kad jūs galėtumėte susigyventi, nes mano visuomeniai nereikia nieko priversti, nieko tikėti. Logiškai, šitas įstatymas veikia, mes todėl jį ir padarėm. Nereikia niekom tikėti.
That a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain of these moral absolutes is in power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable, it reduces things that we all take for granted, like equal justice before the law, like the idea that the law is supposed to equally apply to everybody, whether they're a member of your family or whether they're not. And there are broad cultural differences in these questions. I mean, to pretend that all human societies have equality under law is obviously not true. It's not remotely true, actually. There's a very good book called The Weirdest People in the World, all about the idea that we in the West have this sort of ethnocentric view of ourselves, where we think everybody thinks like people in the West, but the truth is that because we are Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, we have particular views of the world. Those views are drawn from a particularistic tradition. That particularistic tradition is biblical in nature. I mean, it is Judeo-Christian in nature, even if you're just describing European society or American society historically speaking. So the kind of removal of God from the equation, your suggestion is that God makes a person impervious to countervailing responses. And my answer is yes. God does make a person impervious to countervailing responses, including the evils of one's own heart, if you truly believe that God is standing above you, telling you not to do that thing. And again, social science tends to bear this out. People who believe that God is above them tend to give more charity, for example. People who tend to live inside religious communities, within the religious community. And again, I'm not going to pretend that I think all religions are equivalent in their truth propositions, because I don't. I mean, if I did, I wouldn't be wearing a yarmulke, right? So that's just what it is. Inside religious communities, a lot of social bonds and a lot of social frameworks are built on the basis of this shared belief system. In other words, diversity itself, self-interest, cannot always check self-interest, and it tends to tear apart societies and communities unless there is an orienting goal. That orienting goal traditionally has been performed by...
Bet iš Alekso pozicijos tas orienting goal, kur gaidina visus, gali būti tiesiog evoliucija. Našo ekvilibrimas, kas geriausia yra, kas geriausia tau ir grupiai. Išgyvenimo mechanizmas, mes kaip žmonės išmokom be jokio religinio ir tikėjimo aspekto, grupiai išgyventi lengviau, daugiau monkeys together strong, tipo. Bet Benis ištisai daro va tokias prielaidas, kurias pateikia kaip faktą. Bet tai nėra faktas, yra ginčytina. Ir greičiausiai net ne tai, kad ginčytina, priešingai mokslas pasakytų.
By church. It's been traditionally performed by the idea that you are serving God together. And because of that, people build these social bonds, including the institutions of police, for example, to prevent people from killing each other, because we now all agree that killing is wrong, and so we ought to have a third party that we can actually give the power to stop that killing. So again, I think that the question of utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call it something else.
I think it's all very well and good when this religious tradition is protecting what you think is good. But as we know, it can do the exact opposite.
Exactly.
And it can do so with the same force.
Sure,
and
exactly.
I suppose the question we have to ask is whether this is a worthwhile trade-off. That is to say, you know, there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behavior, there is no...
Pavyzdžiui, į krikščionišką kokį pasaulį atvaro islamą išpažįstantys žmonės, ir tada žiūrėk, tos klausimus jau reikia atsakyti, ir tu negali atsakyti tos klausimus. That's exactly my point. Yeah, exactly my point. Alex is on point.
Nothing you can do. Nothing to talk people out of them, because
Yes.
precisely because that's where they place.
Nesitikėjimas yra
And
nuodas.
That seems dangerous to me, and it seems. For example, you know, a lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier. It can make people more socially cohesive. It can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say is a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you, by the way.
Just because you mentioned how the sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually...
he's good too.
Actually, the great... I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition, because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about, you know, the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like, a society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property. now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent, for Adam was formed first, then Eve.
Oh, shit! Mano citata! Mano citata jis pasakė. Ta, kur... Oh, no, there's no way! Kur aš užsirašęs tą fuck? Religion.
Come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man.
Čia tą, ką aš cituoju, James version Timothy 2. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over man, but to be silent. Taip pat, kad moteris puoštųsi kukliai ir padoriais drabužiais, droviai ir santūriai, nesupintais plaukais ar auksu, ar perlais, ar brangių drabužių, kaip dera moterims pasižyminčiams dievo baimingumu, gerais darbais. Moteris tesimoko tyliai, su visišku paklusnumu. Čia aš tą jums esu daug kartų citavęs, literally tą jis pacitavo. Literally šitą momentą. It's fucking insane. Aš tą vieną citatą turiu, ne citatą vieną, bet vieną tą iškarpą turiu, tokia kaip komiška iliustracija, ant kiek fucking deranged yra ir tūpa religija. Jis būtent tą fucking pacitavo.
Rather, she should remain silent, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the Sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution which he authored was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mentioned in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers and were speaking in the name of the religion while they were doing it. So to take the abolitionist movement as an example, I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously religious person and a big believer in the New Testament. Isaac Newton, obviously deeply ensconced in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution. The point about religion, and this is why when I wrote my book, I have to name the title now and plug myself because that's the way it works. The right side of history. But the reason that I talked about how reason and moral purpose made the West is because I think that one of the fundamental precepts of at least Judeo-Christian religion is that when God gives a text or a set of ideas to human beings, he expects us to use our reason to apply to those texts. And so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always been the case in my religion anyway. So I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas. And the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion, and when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and has spawned then other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework, it doesn't exist, meaning that once if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human judgment, those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. Social structures. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that religion is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rises in suicidal ideation.
Čia klaida, tai nėra dėl to. No, tam šimtai skirtingų priežasčių yra. No.
Especially over the last 10 years, tremendous individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection. Right? All of these things are things that, frankly, used to be provided by church and these social institutions that, again, were oriented.
Jeigu tokias nesąmonės pradedam sakyti, kur causationo nėra, tai, kai religija buvo populiariausia, marai egzistavo. Okay? What the fuck? No. Ir karų daugiau buvo.
Toward a single purpose. So when you talk about the idea that, I'm going to put aside the free will discussion because I think, again, it's easy to get caught up in the reversion to the argument that I was making before when you were saying that, can you argue the man out of stabbing you? To use your framework, I mean, you can't argue him out of doing anything. I mean, you're going to say words, the words are going to have an impact, but you can't argue him out of doing...
Problema čia, aš nežinau, gal jie tar paminėjo iš vienos kitos pusės. Problema nėra tai, kad tu negali jo argument out of stabbing you. Bet, kokias pasiekmes mes darysim ir kuo paremtas, ar kokius mes įstatymus turim, kad jisai negalėtų to daryti bent jau in the first place, arba bent jau būtų, kaip čia, kontroliuojamas. Tai arba institucijų, arba moralinių vertybių, kurias mes per filosofiją apgalvojimą atėjom, arba per tikėjimą. Nes jeigu per apgalvojimą visuomenę, kokį tu žmogų be pasisodinsi ir jo paklausi, ar tu nori mirti, jeigu jis sveiko proto bus, greičiausiai sakys, nenoriu mirti. Nebent ant kraštiniai atvejai, žinai, bus. Ir tada gerai. Tai kaip mes padarom, kad abudu nemirtumėm? Tai padarom įstatymą, kad negalima žudyti kitą. Ok, cool. Atėjo ne iš tikėjimo, tiesiog logika, racionali logika. Ok, čia aš supaprastinu labai, bet bear with me. Bet tada iš tikėjimo, kai tu turi tikėti, aš tikiu, nes man Dievas pasakė. Bet jis tiki, nes jam Dievas pasakė. Ir viskas, jūs nebeturi sutarimo. Jūs nebegalit kartu, nebent atitiktų tikėjimas tam tikrų klausimų, tada galit, bet jūs negalit to įstatymo priimti ar su to sutarti, nebent jums taip pat sako tas tikėjimas. Bet tikėjimo ir vairių, jis nėra niekom pagrįstas, jis yra tikėjimas. O mano atveju yra logika pagrįstas, kuris yra fundamentaliai visiems vienodas. 2 + 2 yra lygu 4, fundamentaliai visiems, nepriklausomai nuo nieko. Logika pati, 2 mažiau už 3 yra nenuginčiama logika. Visiems vienoda. Arba, kai tikėjimo, tu ir pradedi kurti, ji nėra visiems vienoda. Jūs neturit bendros kalbos, kurias, gal čia tas argumentas. Kai tu pasikliauni tikėjimu, vietoj to filosofiją ar logiką ir bandot priimti įstatymus, jūs nekalbat tą pačią, jūs neturit bendros kalbos, kurias jūs išnekėtumėt. Ir tame yra problema. Jeigu remsas logika, tu realiai fundamentaliai su visais kalbi tą pačią kalbą. Jeigu kalbi tikėjimu, yra labai daug tikėjimų, jis nėra niekuom pagristas ir niekaip negali pamatuoti ir čia jau nebe ta pati kalba. Yra labai panašus dalykai šitą temą kalbant, kaip mes formuojame įstatymus ir panašiai. Bet yra fundamental skirtumas, kad vienas remiasi tikėjimu, kas negali būti visiems vienodas by definition, nes tai yra tikėjimas subjektyvus.
Doing anything, but not to
ką realiai Aleksas ir pasakė, kad, kuris tas problemas ir mato, bet jie dabar biškai apie kitą dalyką nukrypo, pačio to argumento ir nedresuoja, nes ką Aleksas ir pasakė, jis mato pavojų tame, kad kas bus, jeigu tas kito tikėjimo šalininkas pasirodo akiratį, nes jo pasaulėžiūra ir visuomenė kaip konstruojama pagal, vėlgi, filosofiją, moralus atėjus iš filosofijos, apmąstymo, diskusijos, jie yra daug stipresnė ir Alekso visuomeniai tų problemų nekyla. Jeigu tu ateisi su random kitokiais tikėjimais, tu gali tikėti, kom nori, bet tu negali pažeisti įstatymų, kuriuos mes sukūrėm pagal logiką, ne pagal tikėjimą. Ir pagal tos įstatymus visi turi paklusti, nes jie yra logiški visiems, o ne viena religija pasakė, kad visi turi paklusti. Ir čia yra fundamental dalykas, nes tai šis argumentas, man atrodo, visiškai vienapusiškai yra ne religijai, kad religija nėra gera visuomenė šituo atveju. Nes visuomenė tu gali sukonstruoti solidžią, stabilę, kur visi gali egzistuoti ne pagal religinius įsitikinimus. Ne veltui ir Amerika, kur vadinamas tas huge melting pot. Jie atskiria religiją nuo church and state. Atskirta yra. Tu gali tikėti visais dalykais, bet įstatymą, leidime, religija nedalyvauja. Mes kūrim kitaip įstatymus. Nes jie irgi, kodėl suprato. O nežinau, kokią čia šalį gal būtų galima. Pavyzdį, kur pagal religiją kurti įstatymai, kiek ten kitatikių yra. Kiek ten kitų žmonių su kitokia nuomonė ir kitokiom moraliniam vertybėm gali būti. Ką žinai, rasim tokių šalių? Arba jeigu rasim, tada bus visokie ten holokaustai, etniniai valymai ir religiniai karai, čiūjų. Nes pagal religiją, man atrodo, čia vienareikšmiškai laimi tas argumentas, kad religija nėra gera visuomenė. Gal ir gerai tokioje situacijoje turėti teologijos degree? Kokioje situacijoje?
Get back into a topic that we've handled. Free will is done.
I'm not gonna answer that, although hopefully people will know from what I said before that I think it's still sensible to say you can argue somebody out of something. The first half of what you say there is in so many words, I think, what I was saying before, which is that, yes, this goes both ways. That is, thanks be to God when he is able to provide us with the grounding for resisting oppression and throwing off tyranny.
Yeah.
But what about when the same God is used to justify the exact opposite? All I'm saying is that this goes both ways. And we'll never know.
In terms of utility, right? You're building a society. Let's say that I won't say you're God. Let's say that you are master of a society, and you get to build that society.
Okay.
One of the things that presumably you are going to do is you're going to build in certain things that are untouchable.
Yes.
Right? There's going to be certain moral precepts that you're going to build in that are untouchable. And
how do you get to those?
Justify those things to people such that they are going to believe you. You're going to either have to use compulsion, or you're going to...
Logika racionalė, o netikėjimą. Logika racionalė, matematika, skaičiais, kas yra tikslu ir visiems vienoda, o netikėjimu. Aš visą tą paaiškinau 5 kartus, Benas tik dabar, jis ką nežiūri mano video.
They have to use some sort of other argument that is so strong that they are going to overweigh their self. I mean, there's a reason why.
Taip, logika, matematika, taip. So strong, it's undeniable, nes tai visiems vienodai ir negali tu to nuginčyti, nebent tu kliksi 2 + 2 = 6.
Just that he didn't believe in God, but he hoped that his maid did, so she wouldn't steal the silverware.
Yeah, that's an interesting indictment on the position that theists don't say that atheists can't be moral, right? When people have this argument about morality,
atheists can certainly be moral.
Well,
kas darė, kažkas turėjo žiauriai gerą apie tą kažkalbų. Gal Sam Harris morals? Kažkas, man atrodo, turėjo puikiai tokį monologą. Ne, ten kalbėjo apie moralus efeis. Kad kažkaip jis ten išsireiškia, kad jis kaip tik kad jis nori gyventi visuomeniai, kur moralai bus racionalizuoti, atėję iš racionalės ir apmąstymo, ne iš tikėjimo. Ir jis ten labai gerai artikuliavo tą, aš dabar galvoju. Bet aš nežinau, aš neturiu to. Ne, matau, ten Sam Harris buvo, ten, yra keletas, matau, ten senesnis buvo, ten toks vienas dedukas kažkoks, aš nežinau, nepamenu, aš neturiu jų po ranka, reikia susaugot.
Oftentimes people have this misunderstanding of the argument. Christopher Hitchens did it best in saying, we don't need divine permission to be good and all of this.
Palag, Hitchens? Christopher Hitchens, gal čia tas buvo? Nah.
If God does not exist, why do all people have a fixed moral obligation to love and not murder? How do molecules in motion have any authority to tell you how to behave? Benzene molecule, who? Standard are you breaking? Who are you displeasing? The carbon atom, the benzene molecule, who?
This question has been asked, Socrates answered it like this, when he was on trial for his life. Accused of blasphemy, by the way.
How did you say?
He said that he had an inner daemon, was the way he put it. Not demon, a daemon, a spirit, an inner critic, a conscience would be one way of putting it. And that he knew enough to know, even when he was making the best speech of his life, that if he was making a point that was somehow dishonest or incomplete or shady, the daemon would tell him, yeah, that was clever, but you shouldn't have tried it. He knew. Okay? Any person of average moral equipment has the same knowledge. I hope you'll. If you don't, I'm very sorry for you. Adam Smith called it the internal witness, who we all have to have a conversation with all the time. It's been C.S. Lewis decided to call it conscience and to attribute it to the divine, but he didn't improve on what Adam Smith said in the Theory of Moral Sentiments or what Socrates said when standing trial for his own life. It's been sometimes colloquially defined as, why do people behave well when nobody's looking? I don't believe there's anyone in this hall who doesn't know what I mean by that. Why, when it won't do you any good, will you decide, I could have kept that wallet I found on the back of the cab seat, but I'm not going to. I'm going to turn it in. I'm going to find find its real possessor. There are people to whom those thoughts do not occur, who are deaf to that idea, who only think of themselves, who wouldn't worry about the internal daemon or censor or companion. And there are, of course, people who only get pleasure from being unpleasant to other people and inflicting cruelty on them. The first group we call the sociopathic, and the second group we call the psychopathic. And they occur in nature and in society. My only problem is with those who think that they're all made in the image of God. The one explanation that absolutely doesn't work at all, that gets you nowhere, that explains.
Okay, that pretty good, bet aš net tą turiu minėti, aš nežinau, kas ten tą sakė. Gal ten ir Sam Harris buvo, gal kada nors rasit ir palyginsit. Buvo monologas iš esmės, kad nenoriu gyventi visuomenė ir tai yra bloga visuomenė, kur žmonės tiesiog iš tikėjimo savo moralus, kaip čia pasiema. Ir aš pritariu visiškai, nes jo, ir jis ten labai konkrečiai, man atrodo, paminėjo, kad moralai yra daug geresni ir svaresni, kai jie yra apgalvoti, išdebeitinti iki begalybės, iš visų įmanomų hipotetinių pusių situacijų, žinai, kad tu tikrai surastum pačią esminį dalyką, kur bus solidus ir argumentacija bus solidi. Tikėjimas to neduoda. Tikėjimas duoda daryk taip, įsakymus ir viskas. Nekvestionuok, nedebeitink, ar tikrai taip reikia daryti, ar tikrai kodėl negaliu į tą žmoną pažiūrėti, o kodėl negaliu vogti, kur neleidžia užduoti klausimų. Darai arba kankinsiu pragare tave. Tai jeigu tavo paremtas tikėjimas yra vien tiesiog baimė bausmės, aš nepasitikiu tavim. Nes jeigu tu tik rasi, arba jeigu tu bent akimirkai prarasi motivaciją ar baimę tuo baudėju, o tave tik tai sulaiko, tu nusikaltėlis iškart patampi. Ir aš nepasitikiu tavo moralais ir vertybėm. Bet jeigu tavo tos vertybės ir tikrai moralai ateina kaip visuomeniai, iš didelio debato, iš didelės diskusijos ir tu žinai atsakymus visus tos klausimus, kodėl iš tikrųjų taip reikia daryti, taip galima daryti ar negalima, kodėl mes kaip visuomenė priėmėme įstatymą ir panašiai, jie yra solidus, jie yra argumentai stiprus, foundationas tas pamatas yra geras pastatytas. Netikėjimu, nes taip liepia ir aš bijau bausmės. Tu vis tiek gali bausmės bijoti ir visuomeniai, nes kalėjimų gali bijoti, bet yra labai aiškus atsakymai, kodėl mes turim tą įstatymą. Nes tai buvo išmąstyta, išdiskutuota. Ir jeigu įstatymas yra durnas, arba tiesiog does not make any sense, kaip man atrodo, ten negali minėti Dievo vardo be reikalo, ar ten kažkas kitoks, mes to įstatymą neturim, nes tai yra blogtupas įstatymas. That's the issue, apie ką Aleksas bando vis prieš Shapiro ir Shapiro mėgina įsisukti geščią.
Fine, but as you say, you don't need to believe in God to be good, but you need to believe in God to ground that goodness. But then when you sort of casually throw in this statement by Voltaire, I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does. That implies that actually maybe you do think that without the belief in God, somebody isn't going to.
No, I think that Voltaire thought that he was good, meaning that Voltaire was an atheist and thought that he was good. But his point was sort of back to the Straussian Platonic point.
His point is.
Jo, bet Voltaire'as toj vietoj galėjo tiesiog nepasitikėti, kad kitas žmogus yra protingas, ar priims teisingą sprendimą, ar kažką. O nebūtinai, kad jisai blogas ir voks, ir aš tikiuosi, kad jisai religingas, nes nevoks. Tu gali taip tiesiog išreikšti tą tokį nepasitikėjimą kitų žmogum, nes tu negali jo kontroliuoti galų gale. Ir jeigu tu supranti, kad filosofija užsiimti yra daug sudėtingiau negu pasikliauti tikėjimu, ir didžioji dauguma žmonių yra tiesiog tikinti savinai, tai jo, tu racionalu to bus tikėtis, kad, tikiuosi, kad bus religinga ir nenupysins my shit. That's all very reasonable, Benny.
That he hoped his maid believed in God, because without that belief she wouldn't be able to act morally.
Right. So because again, when we're arguing on the basis of broad societal utility, one of the things, so I happen to be in the happy position of being able to argue that what I think is socially useful also happens to be true. Mm-hmm. The question I'm asking you is whether you think that what is socially useful is actually false or an evolutionary illusion. And I think that's kind of the position that you're taking, unless you want to argue that, generally speaking, religion is either not evolutionarily adaptive, which would be a hard position to actually take.
Well, I think it must be, otherwise it wouldn't exist.
Or you'd have to argue that it's even if it's adaptive, it's of no general benefit to humankind or is an illusion, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's the position that you're taking. So one of the things that I'm enjoying about the conversation is that I don't think either of us are going to argue each other in anything, but it is clarifying what exactly the lines of the division are.
Yes, to backtrack a moment, because you said more than one thing in what I just responded to. You also mentioned, you talked about Isaac Newton being a Christian. So, I mean, people were astonished discovering his private notes to find that he spent more time talking about theology than he did science. This is certainly the case, but I do think it's worth pointing out when people like to notice that the originators of the scientific revolution in particular were believers in God. There are a few things to say on that. First, we don't know what Galileo thought in his heart of hearts, and part of the reason for that is because despite tripping over himself to say, now look, I don't think Scripture is wrong, now look, I believe in God and I am a Christian and I believe in Scripture, but maybe the Earth orbits the Sun, his life falls apart. So suppose he did secretly have doubts about the existence of God. Do you think we'd ever have even found out about it?
And that's an unfalsifiable argument.
I think not a chance. In other words,
but the lack of falsifiability makes it difficult for making a counter argument.
In other words, let's not be so confident.
Maybe he did have a secret diary, but I have no proof that he had a secret diary.
What I'm saying is, let's not be so confident about this. The second thing to say is that these men, if that's what they were remembered for, that is their theology, then they wouldn't be remembered. Thirdly, is that just on the minor point that people often like to point out that, well, the originators of the scientific revolution were religious, and so science can't conflict with religion.
Lol.
I'm not going to make the claim that science does conflict with religion in principle, but supposing that it did, this would not serve as a rebuttal, because if it were the case that the scientific revolution and the scientific method undermines religion, then of course the people who invented the scientific method would themselves have been religious, because they hadn't invented the mechanism by which it came to be undermined yet.
Yeah, but then afterward they presumably would be irreligious or a-religious, which is what happened to Darwin, for example.
It doesn't happen that quickly, right? It really doesn't happen.
On an individual level, it certainly
if we're talking about the development of the scientific method, we're not talking about the kind of thing that just happens in a lifetime. I mean, to attribute it to Galileo and Newton as
Čia Beni visiškai neteisus, kad it just happens, tu negali taip pakeisti fundamentally visko, nebent, I guess, aš kalbu, kodėl jis klysta. Aš nežinau, ar followinat, gerai. Padarė argumentą, kad jeigu atsirado mokslas ir mokslo procesas, o jis atsirado žmonių, kurie religingi buvo, jie sukūrė, tai negali prieštarauti, bet tada Aleksas pasakė, realiai, ne, tai taip ir yra. Turėjo jie egzistuoti tie žmonės religingi, kad sukurtų tą, kuris paneigtų, taip veikia. Bet tada Benis sako, kad tai tada jie turėtų tapti iš karto ateistais, nebetikėti per akimirką. Ką Aleksas iš karto atsakė, kad ne, taip greitai nebūna tokie change'ai. Kas yra visiškai teisybė, ir mes tą žinom iš biologinės pusės. Su amžium mūsų tas smegenų elastingumas, kaip jie vadina, naujų neuronų ten pathways kelių sudarimas lėtėja. Mums sunkiau išmokti naują informaciją, pavyzdžiui, kalbą išmokti vėliau gyvenime, sunkiau negu vaikystėje, ir pakeisti senus įpročius ar įsitikinimus ar panašiai. Sunkiau. Neįmanoma, nėra neįmanoma, bet sunkiau. Tai jeigu tu vėliau visą gyvenimą pakrovęs kažkokio tikėjimo, religiją ar dar kažko, sužinoji, kad tai, mokslinį procesą atsirado, tau tikrai instantly nepakeistų. Gal tau niekad gyvenime to nepakeis. Tai tu būsi tas religingas mokslininkas visą gyvenimą. Tiesiog mūsų smegenis turi apsaugos efektus, turi apsaugos procesus. tą mes vadinam kartais ten tais dalykais, kaip ten kognityvinis disonansas ir panašiai, kad apsaugotų mūsų smegenis nuo tokių dalykų, kur dvi priešingos idėjos gali egzistuoti vienu metu smegenyse, pavyzdžiui. Kognityvinis disonansas, man atrodo, taip ir vadinas. Smegenys tą puikiai daro. Tai vat ir mes galim turėti, mokslininkas, bet jis religingas. Arba, bet aš ką noriu pasakyti, kad Benė čia visiškai klysta, kai sako, laisvai greitai pasikeistų. Ne. Biologija diktuoja, kad ne, kaip tik užtruktų gan ilgai, jeigu iš vis tą padarytų. Bet einant iš kartos į kartą, kai nauji žmonės auga dabar jau ne tik su religija, bet su dviem competing idėjom, pavyzdžiui. Žiūrėk, religija pradeda mažėti, pradeda žinojimas gal pakeisti ar dar kažką, žodžiu, anyway. Bet jo, čia Benį visiškai neteisus net iš biologinės pusės, bet aš nežinau, čia whatever.
As we happily do, is far too
but you're making both an individual argument and a broader historical argument. So pick one.
And so what I'm saying is that the individual beliefs of the founders of that revolution I don't think that revolution would have gotten off the ground enough from just their contributions within their lifetime to shake decades of prior faith. However, when you get to someone like a Darwin, then we start to see agnosticism, then we start to see people having their doubts, and then when you get into the modern era, atheism abounds. And so, in other words, if it were the case that this thesis, which, like I say, is not something that I'm defending here, I'm just sort of rebutting the rebuttal to it. That is, if it were the case that the scientific method were this king of undermining religion, then I think we would expect the fact that those who invented it to have been religious. It would be like saying, isn't it amazing that the person who invented the motor car didn't own a motor car before that?
Well, no, because, again, you've now also made the case that perhaps they had secret diaries, or in their heart of hearts they weren't actually religious or convinced away from that. So, again, that's why I'm saying I feel like you're making a broader historical argument that works, and I think you're making an individual argument that doesn't quite.
I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that we would never know why is that? Why will we never know what Galileo really thought about religion?
Well, I'm going to just accuse you of assuming facts, not in evidence. I mean, like,
let's move it away from
because
Galileo.
Again, I don't want to get into the mind of Galileo, nor do I care very much. But the reality is that many of the people who were the progenitors of the scientific revolution and participants in the scientific revolution specifically were searching for something higher because they thought that that was their godly duty to do so. I mean, this has been true since the time of Roger Bacon. I mean, the idea that you have people who are specifically seeking out the nature of the universe, because there's an understandable, again, another religious precept, there's an understandable universe that God has created, and your mind is a reflection of certain truths that are in that universe. These are all non-materialist atheistic concepts. That was the basis for virtually all of science, including the origins of the scientific revolution. Now, you can make the argument very easily. I mean, I make it all the time because I have to metaphoricalize the beginning of Genesis, for example, that the words of Genesis don't jibe with the words of science when it comes to the age of the universe, for example. And obviously that's true, which is why both Maimonides and Aquinas are talking about in the Middle Ages the idea that if science comes into conflict with religion, you're either getting one of them wrong or you're getting both of them wrong. And so the constant sort of reinterpretation of religion in light of the facts that are established by the scientific method, I don't think that that's a rebuttal of religion. And so and more than that, I think that the peculiar idea that religion itself must fundamentally be undermined by scientific discovery, I don't see quite why.
Fundamentally it is. Nes tu gali rinktis arba žinias, arba tikėjimą. Fundamentally it is undermined. Mokslinis procesas realiai yra tiesiog geresnis procesas žinoti. Jeigu nori žinoti kažką, mokslinis procesas yra daug geresnis procesas. Tai nesako, kad mokslas niekad neklysta, ar mokslinis procesas niekad nepadaro klaidų, ar nėra kartais įtakojamas ten kokių interesų ar dar kažko. Bet pats procesas, taip kaip jis sudėliotas, taip kaip jis veikia, pats procesas yra vienintelis instrumentas, kokį mes turim sužinoti kažką. Tai jeigu tau rūpi sužinojimas, tada jo. Jeigu tau rūpi tikėjimas, tada jo, mokslinis procesas tau netinka. Bet gal galima ginčyti būtų, kad jo, jeigu tu esi tikintis, tu pagal definition esi kvailys. Jeigu mes žodį protingas ir kvailas naudosim pagal tai, kaip dažniausiai žmonės naudoja, nusimano arba žino dalykus. Aš nesutinku, kad toks yra žinojimo apibrėžimas, bet jeigu žmonės naudoja tą, kad, jisai išmano savo profesiją, arba jis žino dalykus ir yra protingas dėl to, tai pagal tą religingas žmogus negali būti protingas, nes jisai nežino, jis tiki dalykais. Kai kurios dalykus gal žino, bet tada aš sakyčiau, tu hipokritas, tada arba pas tavai yra priešprieša, kaip tu gali vienus dalykus žinoti pro žinojimo kažkokius, kaip čia, įrankius, bet apie pasaulį ir žemę ir gyvybę iš tikėjimo. Kodėl čia ta priešprieša yra, bet kaip būtų. Nes jeigu tu galvoji, kad žinojimas yra lygu protingumas, tai tada tikintis žmogus negali būti protingas, nes jis nežino, jis tiki. Bet čia, anyway.
Well, I would agree with that. I'm just saying that the rebuttal that's presented to that opinion fairly commonly, I don't think works for the reasons that I've said.
Okay, well let's give you both a little breather, because we're going to go to another break very shortly. We fitted in so much. And
determinizmas, laisva valia, ką reiškia gerumas visuomenėje, koks dar bus klausimas?
Unemployed.
Before we move on, I don't know if I can have one final word on this Galileo point, because I know it seems quite strange that I'm sort of hypothesizing in this way, but you said that when religion and science come into conflict, either one is wrong or both is wrong. Galileo was wrong about one of these things potentially. What happens if I mean you can? It's great talking about the utility of his religious belief and inspiring his scientific endeavor. But what happens when the immediate fruit of that is him discovering something which should have been a celebrated idea and instead was suppressed, and he ends up under house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life? Why? Specifically because the religious authorities, in their sentencing of Galileo, did not just say that he failed to prove it, did not just say that he was, being a bit of an a-hole in his approach to things, but said specifically because it is false, absurd, and contrary to Scripture.
Exactly.
That is why that scientific position was suppressed on specifically religious motivations.
And far be it from me to defend the Catholic Church and its crackdown on Galileo.
Okay.
You've come to the wrong place for that.
Okay, it's time. It's time for another break here. You are watching and listening to the big conversation from Premier Unbelievable. I am almost anonymous here, Andy Kind, but my day will come. And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. We'll be talking about religion and society. Is religion good for society? So much more still to talk about. We'll see what we can fit in. We will fit in as much as we can, but we'll be back after this short break. Enjoying the conversation? Tell us who persuaded you in our survey. And if you want more from today's conversation, then register to get early access to the next show.
Okay,
Welcome back to part 3 of the big conversation from Premier Unbelievable. Today, we are discussing religion and is it good or bad for society? And we're having a lot of fun with it, I think. I mean, I know you're in disagreement on things, but I think we're just having fun with it today, aren't we?
As ever.
Well, I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. And as I say, we're talking about religion and its role in society. One observation I've got from watching you guys talk, I wonder whether religion is being used as a bit of a catch-all term. You know, there is no summer festival where Ben and I would meet up because we're religious and have a beer together. You know, plenty of Buddhist people don't even believe in God. So we probably don't have the time to unpack it now, but religion is maybe not a helpful catch-all term at all points. I wonder whether, when we're saying religion in this context, we mean the Judeo-Christian worldview. But it's interesting, you know, I, as a Christian, there's lots of things I agree with Ben on, some things I disagree on. Lots of things, as an Englishman, that I agree with Alex on, and other things that I wouldn't.
Spelling.
So, yes, spelling, absolutely. It's aluminium. Anyway, I just think that's interesting. I'm not trying to start this theist gang and gang up on you, Alex at all. But, what do you think quickly about that? When we're talking about religion, do we need to be more semantically sort of accurate?
Rigorous, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, again.
Bet tai negali sakyti, kad anksčiau stabdė mokslo tobulėjimą religiją, niekada nenustojo stabdyti. Aš nesakau, kad anksčiau stabdė ar kad nustojo stabdyti. Jo, ir dabar stabdo. Ai, kad tik anksčiau, nieks taip ir nesako.
I'm not here to defend every form of religion under the sun. There are various forms of religion, ranging from things that people in Judeo-Christian tradition would consider pagan, to Judeo-Christian monotheism, to the distinctions in Judaism and Christianity, which are substantial, obviously. And so, I do believe that there are right forms of religion or righter forms of religion than others. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be a particularist in my religious practice or my religious belief. And so I do think that you're right to sort of boil down the question so that people don't end up defending things or being forced to defend things that they wouldn't defend. I mean, you mentioned before Islam. I'll say more radical forms of Islam because, again, I'm one thing that I tend not to do as a religious believer is simply take people's texts at sort of face value, because the reality is that very few people in religious circles take their text at like I can just pick up a Bible, read it. That really is not how the practice of religion works. I tend to actually...
Ką jūs apibūdinat, tai ir yra problema su religijom, kad ne jie prašyta, bet turi vadovautis, prasideda interpretacijos, visi savaip interpretuot gali ir man tas čia yra tas dalykas, kur religijos šit vien dėl to yra.
Judge faith by faith practice, more so than I do by trying to read somebody else's book and then figure out exactly what they're saying, because I've seen people do that enough to my religious practice to sort of object to it. But yeah, of course, I think that you would have to talk, if you're going to talk about the value of religion, you should be more specific. I will say that the value of religion more general, we're going to talk about it in just general terms, belief in supernatural things that can't be explained by a materialist universe. the social cohesion point would be the best case in favor of religion, is that virtually every study ever done has shown that social cohesion relies on a common orientation among people in order to build commonality between people. There are really only a few structures in human history that do that. One is a kinship structure. The problem with kinship and tribal structures is that they pretty quickly devolve into tribal warfare upon other members of different tribes. One of the things that religion has done is an attempt to universalize that beyond the immediate sort of tribal self-interest.
Čia vienas iš tų argumentų, kur religija taigi atneša pliusą kaip coping mechanizmą, ir dar vienas yra, kad bendruomenės kuria, tipo vienijai bendruomenės ir panašiai. Čia lygiai tos pačios problemos toliau galioja. Turbūt Europos atveju mes galime matyti, kad tu gali priverst, kaip čia, įkalbinti žmonės nustot kariauti dėl religinių visokių įsitikinimų ar dėl whatever, teritorinių įsitikinimų, dėl grupuočių įsitikinimų. Nes religinė grupuotė, teritorinė grupuotė, ta pati grupuotė, bet galų galėtų gali priversti bendradarbiauti ir susigyventi, jeigu padarai gyvenimą patogų. Žiūrėk, visi gali keliauti tarpusai, prekiauti, laisvų daug turi, žiūrėk, ir maždaug suprantu, okay, čia visai works, ir tu taip iš tos evoliucinės pusės žiūrint, tu perprogramuoji vos ne žmogų, kad taip yra daug geriau, negu kad teritoriškai kovoti kaip akmens amžių, žinai. Mano gentis, šita gentis in bloga, kovosim dėl kažko. Mes visko turim, viskas gerai, viskas zaibės. Bet jo, jisai sako, kad čia maždaug religija gali sukelti tą community bendrą jausmą. O tuo tarpu, jeigu to nėra, tada tu grupuojies ir kariausi prieš kitą grupuotę. Bet religija lygiai taip pat kovoja prieš kitas religinės grupuotės. Tu nepabėgi nuo grupuotės etiketės, kurios paskui kariauja ar kovoja. Ar religija dėl religinės grupuotės ir groupthinkas, toks grupinė ideologija dažniausiai prives prie konflikto. Klausimas yra, kaip mes tą konfliktą tada sprendžiam. Jeigu viena grupuotė savo visuomenę kuria pagal kažkokį įstatymą, logiką ir panašiai, jinai galės kalbėti, jinai galės sukalbam būti, jinai galės sukurti taikos kažkokį. O jeigu tavo religija sako užmušk, jo religija sako užmušk, viskas. Jūs neturi to diskurso. And that's worse.
We discussed a little bit ago. And again, pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, that provide us friendship structures, marriages, that a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it. And so the sort of breakdown of those structures, you could make the case, I suppose, for the breakdown of those structures, but there's been pretty much no replacement for those structures in secular society, and it's creating some pretty significant strains on societal bonding.
Correct. So I do have two things to say.
I'm going to ask you, I want you to say both of those things, but I want to ask you, Alex, can secular societies potentially achieve the same level of social cohesion as...
Čia realiai yra tas argumentas, kur aš sakau, ir aš nežinau, kaip tą padaryti, bet man atrodo, visuomenės gali pakeisti visus egzistuojančius religinius pliusus be tikėjimo. Tai kai religija naudoja ir tą pliusą naudoja kaip coping mechanizmą, kažkas blogo atsitiko, atsisuka žmogus į religiją, kaip, padės jam ištvertą, pavyzdžiui, sunkų laikotarpį ir panašiai. Tam yra psichologai, terapeutai ir mes galim pakeisti be tikėjimo aspekto. O per logiką, vėlgi per dylinimą su emocijom, o ne tiesiog per tikėjimą kažkokį, kad Dievas ten atleis, išgelbės ir viskas bus gerai. Lygiai taip pat būrimas į grupės, bendruomenės ir panašiai. Mes galim tą pakeisti. Sunkiau, aišku, tai reikalauja resursų ir noro tą daryti, aišku, bet galim. Nėra priežasties, kodėl negalim kažkodėl to padaryti. Galim grupės įsteiginėti visokias, kur tą ir daro realiai, tos bendruomenės visokias, kur bendruomenės namus galim. Bet galima ir per edukaciją. Jeigu tu išmoksi žmonės racionaliai ir kritiškai mąstyti, vertinti informaciją, konstruktyviai diskutuoti, tu jau realiai juos jau sujungiai pro bendrą kalbą, juos visus. Tu jiem davai įrankius ne tik, kad konfliktus spręsti, bet ir relatinti vien su kitu. Mes remiamės logiko, nerandom tikėjimų, kur bet kas gali bet kaip interpretuoti. Tai mes tikrai galim tą padaryti. Ir religija to nesiūlo, vėlgi, tai kas visuomeniai geriau, man atrodo, vienareikšmiškai laimi ne religija.
Religious ones.
Potentially, maybe. I don't know. That seems to be an empirical question.
Čia klausimas ne ar religija ir antireligija yra geriau visuomenė, o ar religija naudinga visuomenė. Tai aš vis dar lieku prie savo seno atsakymą, kuris iš tikrųjų neįtikėtinai gerai atsilaiko šitoj diskusijoje kol kas, kad ankstesnė visuomenė, turbūt gal net dabartinė visuomenė, kai kur religija turi gerų dalykų kartais. Tai va toksai, bet ateities visuomenė ir tokio, link kokios mes turėtumėm eiti, link tikrai geros visuomenės ar taikesnės visuomenės ar panašiai, religija tikrai nėra naudinga visuomeniai. Ok, toliau. Nes toj visuomeniai mes tos religijos suteikiamus persyvintus pliusus suteiksim pro kitus dalykus ne pro tikėjimą, tipo. Tai jo, ok, toliau.
On social cohesion as a subject, I wanted to, I suppose, in response to that question, mention the history of the United States as a constitutionally secular nation. Presumably the discussion there devolves into whether America can be described as a Christian nation or not. But based on what you just said a moment ago, before we maybe get into that, you said, of course, we need more specificity is hardly ever worse than less, and that you're not trying to defend all religious traditions. And then you say, but look, this idea of there being a God and there being an unalterable authority and a moral author of the universe is itself valuable, and without it, there are all kinds of societal discohesion comes about. In that case, for example, I wonder, and I hope it's not a crude question, and it's one sort of stemming from genuine interest. Would you rather your child comes to you and says, you know, I think I'm going to convert to Islam, or said, I don't think I believe in God anymore?
As a Jew, I'm fairly indifferent. Meaning that my priority is for my child to remain a Jew, and which direction they go from there is of much less interest to me than staying inside the religious tradition that I believe is correct.
Okay, maybe I should rephrase to say, suppose that, you know, half of the U.S. population immediately, right now, and half of, let's say half of the Christian population. So it's not to do with Judaism, and it's not to do with your own family. Half of the Christian population in the United States are immediately going to convert today to atheism if you press this button, or to Islam if you press this button. Which one would you press?
So I'm going to ask for more specificity in line with the conversation. So which form of Islam are we talking about, and which form of atheism are we talking about? Because they come in various strains. But meaning, like,
fair question, I guess.
If we're just starting from the premise of no God or Islamic God, that actually is not enough information. Because as I say, I'm not judging people based on their faith propositions nearly as much as I am based on their behavior, which I think they base on faith propositions.
Well, let's say this is the only thing that changes. You press this button, half the Christian population become convinced that there is no real God of the universe. Everything else is random. Whatever you might, because what we're discussing here is essentially what are the implications of such a worldview.
Right.
What are the implications of atheism, which is just the disbelief in God, or the belief that there is.
Do people have memories? Sorry, in this hypothetical, do people have memories or they don't have memories? Because this makes a difference.
They have memories.
Okay, fine. So then probably in the West, atheism, as opposed to a more radical form of Islam. That's why I was asking for specificity, because they're more moderate
button on the
forms.
right-hand side was going to be that they just become convinced that Muhammad is the final prophet of God.
Right, and again, I was going to ask for more specificity on that, because I know many moderate Muslims who are not radical in the implication of their faith, as opposed to some who very much are quite radical in the implications of their faith. So, but let's, if you don't mind, I'm going to set up your hypothetical in a way that I think is more clarifying for me anyway, and that is button on the right is radical Islam, like Taliban-style Islam.
Okay.
And button on the left is don't believe in God.
Well, I mean, you can do that.
The reason I'm doing that is because that elucidates a difference that I think is being obscured by the simple sort of belief in God, not belief in God question, meaning that the cultural heritage of that's why I asked if people have memories or people don't have memories. If people have memories, then that looks very much like secular Europe right now, which does have
the cultural heritage
in the bloodstream a lot of Judeo-Christian values in a way that would not be true if you were without memory. Right? Would I rather that a child found in a forest be raised in a moderate Muslim household or be raised in a secular communist?
Čia realiai tas hipotetinis, aš suprantu, kur Aleksas ėjo, bet čia Shapiro jo gali laisvai išslysti, nes jis čia techniškai teisus, nes ateistas su ateistu nepalygins ir to pačio islamo su islamu nepalygins.
Household?
Or a secular atheist
aišku, bus į tų bezėmerį,
Again, from which tradition? In the USSR, are we talking in Britain? What are we talking
We're talking
about
here? Britain.
Okay, so
we were talking about the US, but let's say Britain.
In Britain, depends on we're talking about like a liberal form of Islam, which do exist, then probably a liberal form of Islam. If we're talking about a fundamentalist form of Islam, then probably a secular strain of Britain.
Fine.
True.
The second point was to say, I mean, you mentioned not wanting to just take Scripture at face value, and I understand that the difficulty of taking Scripture essentially out of context and trying to...
Aš norėjau daugiau video šiandieną pažiūrėti, bet gausis, kad aš tą beveik visą streamą žiūriu, žiūriai išvargino šitas video, čia reikėjo labai įdėmiai klausytis ir labai daug mąstyti apie tai, dar nesibaigė video, 20 minučių liko.
Literal approach where a literal approach isn't supposed to be taken. I mean, people forget that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a book with lots of different
with an oral tradition and all the rest.
I saw a video once of somebody trying to use the Bible to disprove the divinity of Jesus by quoting the book of Job, saying, "God is not a man that I might question him." God is not a man, you see, and I thought not only is this in the mouth of Job, but also, that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid. But it does seem to me that there are some things within religious scripture that do need to be taken seriously and do need to be taken essentially at face value. That is, some of the very specific legalistic commandments of the Old Testament, for example, or of the Hebrew Bible, I should say. These are not, when people list these and say that these are potentially morally problematic and may have done something towards...
Jonafo apelsinai, o jeigu neišsisprendžia, tada tokia Dievo valia. Tame problema yra, kad tu negali niekad laimėti prieš juos, jie visą laiką turės kaip paaiškinti.
For example, like I mentioned earlier, the abolition of slavery in the United States. Of course, there was a great deal of religious influence on both sides, which is something that I've already mentioned. But don't you think that this problem could have been solved a lot more easily if there had been a stronger religious tradition of opposition to the ownership of other human beings? Why can't that have been the case?
Okay,
because Scripture quite explicitly condones it.
Right,
and in fact gives you the
details.
That's something that couldn't have been done, in other words, because you've taken
now I get to do Talmudic law. So
this moral principle that's placed outside of meaningful debate.
Right. Before we move on, can I ask, where are we getting these buttons from? Are they from Amazon? You know, you press one and everyone's an atheist.
There's this wonderful thing
that these available on the market
that I think you both need to use in this conversation, which is imagination.
Oh, right.
So let's. As far as why didn't the Bible prescribe the perfect world as I would see it, or as you might see it, and the answer is because two reasons. One, as stated right up top, I'm not God. I assume he has different logic than I do. Mm-hmm. Two, the Bible is in an inherently problematic position in the sense that, on the one hand, it's trying to divulge important truths for all time. At the same time, it's talking to a people of a particular time.
Yes.
And this is a well-worn tradition inside Judaism. So to take the slavery example, there is no mandate to hold slaves in the Bible. Right? There are lots of mandates in the Bible. Many, many mandates. There are 613 of them according to my religion, right? That's why I do all these weird things that I do. But one of those mandates is not to hold slaves. Right? And so the idea of there was a society that existed at the time of the Bible in which slaveholding was not only ubiquitous, it was universal, and which was true for virtually all of human history.
That's right.
And could be justified not just in terms of religious scripture, but in terms of Aristotelian thought. Right? I mean, the great philosophers we like to cite sometimes in the secular tradition are big fans of slavery, and that's true virtually up until the 18th century.
Yes.
So the idea would be, is this verse attempting to woo people away from a tradition of slavery or to humanize the slave?
Aš sakyčiau, kad religija, jeigu jos nepriverstų, jinai nebūtų judėjus niekur, jokių koncesijų nepadarius. Jeigu mes sakom, kad žiūrėkit, blogus dalykus ir religija, ir ten, pavyzdžiui, vergovė, ir religija, ir visi, ir filosofai turbūt ten, ne visi, bet sutiko. Bet tada mes introducinam tokį arba, filosofą, kuris galvoja priešingai. Ir jis paskleidžia tas idėjas. Dabar religija gali atmesti, ne. Ir viskas. Jiem nereikia nieko filosofuoti, ne. Dievas taip kitaip sako, reiškia, tu klysti ir viskas. Tuo tarpu ta idėja tarp filosofų arba mokslinio proceso metu, koks tyrimas, jinai stovi ir laukia. Ir po biškai gauna daugiau dėmesio, nes jinai make sense, rezultatai rodo, pavyzdžiui, vienai per kitaip. Ir viskas istoriškai kas buvo, tai dalykai, kuriuos religija viena ar kita teigia, ar kad ir visi galvojo visuomenė ir panašiai, religija buvo priversta pakeisti nuomonę šiek tiek, interpretuoti šiek tiek kitaip dėl naujų mokslinių įrodymų pasirodžiusių. Ir taip eina ištisai. Visuomenė keičias, pagrindė mokslinis procesas, mokslas apskritai keičia visuomenę ir aš čia apibendrinu. Žmonės įgavo žinių ir religija buvo priversta prisiderinti ir iš kažkaip skirtingai interpretuoti tekstą ir panašiai. Ir čia yra didžiausia toks, gal ne didžiausias, bet vienas iš argumentų, kad kam tada iš vis tikėti religiją, kai over and over klysta ir turi pripažinti, kad klydo, prisitaikydama. Dabar žiūrėk, net popiežius ten pradeda pasisakyti apie ten gėjus ir vienalytės santuokas ir panašiai. Ir va tame problema yra. Kad kam tada, kodėl mes iš vis to norim, kad mums pudrintų smegenis, tai tiesiog iškart žiūrim į mokslą. Jeigu religija paskui jį pastoviai čia ir keičia viską, tai ir vėl tas pavyzdys. Kažkada buvo 1000 dievų, viskam. Ugnis dega, ugnies dievas. Saulė šviečia, saulės dievas. Mėnulio dievas, viskam dievai, nes mes nežinojom nieko apie nieką. Tada ateina per mokslinį procesą, tuometinį, tarkim, atsiranda žinių šiek tiek. Pasirodo, ugnis yra nekoks dievas, mes galim ugnį kontroliuoti, tai yra, mes suprantam, kaip ugnis veikia. Tada mes suprantam, kaip saulė veikia. Ir su kiekvienu to supratimu ir žinių atsiradimu, tas dievas dingo, tas dievas dingo, tas dievas dingo ir dievai mažėjo. Ir dabar jau ir religijų tų mažėjo visų. Ir dabar liko tos keletą, kur jos dar vadovaujasi moraliniais principais visokiais ir visko. Bet dabar žiūrėk, mes kaip visuomenė, vėlgi, nusprendė per mokslą, pavyzdžiui, per psichologiją ir kitus mokslus, kad homoseksualumas vis dėlto nėra liga. Tai jeigu tai nėra liga, visuomenė priema tą, nes tai yra įrodyta per daug metų, daug tyrimų, kad natūrali žmogaus kondicija. Tai žiūrėk, tada reikia mums kaip visuomeniai eiti su faktais. Ir religija turi eiti iš paskos. Ir jinai turi reinterpretuoti iš naujo žodžius, kur 100 metų kartojo, kaip faktą visišką. Tai yra nuodas, tai yra smegenų fucking nuodas. Mokslas yra dievas. Ne, nes tai implantų, kad mes tikėjimu užsiema, mokslas neužsiema tikėjimu. Ir aš gal išsiplečiu biškai, bet tas fundamental konceptas, koks religija yra šūdas ir koks tikėjimas yra šūdas. Ir kai tu net, jeigu kartais ir pataikai kažkokiu atveju, tu nebūsi teisus, nes žinai. Tu būsi labiau teisus, kaip tas, kur sugedęs laikrodis porą kardinoj teisingą laiką rodo. Tu nežinai, nes tavo institucijoje nėra žinojimui principų, nėra mechanizmo, kuris galės tau suteikti žinojimą. Tai yra tik tikėjimas.
Or is it attempting to reinforce that by making it harsher and more difficult? And that's why actually one of the things I enjoy doing in terms of how I study the Bible, for example, is I like to look at contemporaneous religious texts of the time. So I like to study the Bible alongside, for example, Hammurabi's code. It's really interesting to notice the differences and where the Bible is liberalizing Hammurabi's code, for example.
Absolutely.
And so the idea that a divine revelation has to be given to human beings who are capable of following that in the time. Again, that's part of the difficulty of I think rebutting religion in a certain sense, because again, it seems wiggly, but it really isn't, in the sense that if you believe, as I do, in a God who spoke to human beings in some form or fashion and has to speak to them on a level that they can understand, in ways they can understand, then that immediately is going to discount the ability to do a lot of very radical things that would have appeared radical in 1200 BC, but now appear to be commonplace for us.
Yes, I understand this argument, and I've heard it many times. I must say that it seems strange to me that God does seem willing to completely and utterly condemn a bunch of other practices, including, by the way, imaginary crimes like witchcraft, just done away with entirely. And even if it is the case that God, for some reason, couldn't even hint at the idea that maybe eventually we should be moving towards the abolition of the idea of owning human beings as private property, he just had to condone it.
But yes.
I still think it's the case that he would not permit a flat immorality, and I think you would agree with that too. And so when I open the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and when I look at the texts saying that if you lay siege to a city, you can kill, if the Lord delivers it into your hand, you can kill the men and the women, or you can kill the men and keep the women and the children and the livestock as plunder, as Deuteronomy says. And in the very next verse, the very next chapter says that, if you see a good-looking woman, and I'm not interjecting, if somebody finds an attractive woman,
yes, if Fatawar is the actual Hebrew, yeah,
then they can take them for themselves, and if they want them as their wives, and they take them home, they shave their head, they cut off their fingernails, they give them 30 days to mourn their old husband, who you may very well have just killed, and then you can take them as your wife. When Numbers 31 has Moses
words to live by,
saying kill all the men, and this time the women get killed too, but not the women who haven't slept with a man. And why might that be? And it says that, keep them for yourselves. And I hear all the time that this is some kind of liberalizing process. Maybe it's because, these people wouldn't survive on their own. It's some kind of protective measure to make sure that you're looking after them. If that's the case, then why does it only apply to the virgins? That seems a little bit suspect to me. It's sort of, Scripture's littered with these kinds of...
Reikia pasakyti, kad Ben Shapiro turbūt atlieka geriausią gynybą, kokią įmanoma religijos. Ir tai yra tragiškas darbas, nes aš sakau, negali būti gerų argumentų, tam tiesiog nėra, nes tai yra visiškai neracionali pozicija. Bet Ben Shapiro turbūt atlieka geriausią, kokią įmanoma, gal ten vienas kitas, gal iš kito kampo biškai. Tai jeigu čia geriausia gynyba yra, ne.
With these kinds of
well, again, so to go back to the sort of oral tradition nature,
and I don't think God would permit a proactive immorality, even if he can't, for some reason, abolish the practice altogether, if you see what I'm saying.
No, that last point I don't see. So when you say even if he can't abolish the practice altogether,
which already I think he would be able to do.
Right, so the question is whether he can or whether he can't. If he can't abolish the practice, then the idea of wooing people away from a particular type of sin through a gradualistic process is known throughout societies across human history. I mean, the gradualistic processes are the way that most things get done across human history. And by the way, the universal practice, unfortunately, up till today in many places in the world, is in fact the extreme version of what you're talking about. Raise everything, kill everyone. Right? That sort of stuff, unfortunately, does take place, even on planet Earth, even in the year 2023. And so the idea of a culture arising from the Bible that not only abolished slavery on its own shores, but then abolished slavery literally everywhere else, which is what Great Britain did. That, again, to separate that off from a tradition that also says that every human being is made in the image of God, right, which is the verse from Genesis, or that you have to treat the stranger well, right, which is repeated more than any injunction in the Bible, right? There are these traditions that are at war with each other inside the Bible, which is why there is this hotly fought kind of argument inside biblical circles about all of this stuff, which again is one of the reasons why I said right up top that when it gets to I can't just open the Bible and interpret the text as I would see fit. You say, well, I don't like this verse right here.
Contradictory?
Yeah.
You say that Scripture is contradictory?
Well, I say that Scripture is, some Scripture is time-bound and some Scripture is not. So the easy one, the sort of easy way to distinguish is that when the Bible says not to do a thing, then that tends to be non-time-bound.
And when it says to do a thing?
And when it says to do a thing, that may be a temporary permission structure, but it could also be a wooing.
Kiek reikia mental gimnastikų ir pateisinimų, kad pateisinti tiesiog nesąmonę parašytą. Žiūrėjau, kai sako, kad nedaryti, tai laikas, belaikinė nuostata, bet jeigu sako daryti, tai realiai tik tam tikram kontekste ir tam tikram laike galiojo tas. Jesus.
And by the way, again, I'm not speaking out of turn here. This has been 1,500 years of Jewish reinterpretation of Esha Yifat, to take a quick example, right? The War Bride, the long-standing Talmudic tradition, which again is almost 2,000 years old at this point, is that was deliberately an attempt to avoid mass war rape, which again, you can scoff at that, but mass war rape happened on this continent 70 years ago when the Russians literally raped everyone as they came into Germany. So these evils continue to exist in the human heart.
Even if this was a liberalizing force, and even if this was not as bad as other slavery, do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God commanding something which you now see to be, or rather permitting something and explicitly and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
Because he's not permitting me, permitting my great to
do something immoral,
to do something
immoral
that in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
right.
But was it immoral?
By today's standards that were developed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, sure.
But by today's standard neimmoral, bet tada buvo moral. Bet tai mes dabar geriau žinom. Bet tai nekeičia fakto, kad tada buvo immoral. Ir religija žiūrėjo tik tai, kas tuo metu galvoja. Tuo tarpu, jeigu būtų procesas, pro kurį mes dabar priimtų objektyviai geresnių tada moralų, ir buvo tie dalykai, kurie tada ir pakeitė ir progresą darė į priekį. Aš labai sunkiai sekasi artikuliuoti šitą. gal Aleksas tą ir pagavo iš tikro.
Did immoral, but was it immoral?
By today's standards that were developed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral. Which, by the way, you're living off the. You're again, not to get back to the Tom Holland argument. You're living off the remains. I mean, where's your morality coming from?
But who's the moral relativist now? I mean, it seems. A moment ago, you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now, when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be.
Jo, ir vienintelis dalykas, kas dabar padaro, kad tai mes dabar matytumėm, kad tai yra bad, iš tikrųjų tai ne religija. Nes religija vejasi. Tai buvo filosofija, logika, mąstymo žmonių ir panašiai. Ne religija.
Now, by the progress of Judeo-Christian values, who's the moral relativist?
Well, it's not relativistic to say that a thing
Shapiro visiškai neturi kaip apginti šitų pozicijų.
Is considered wrong today because of a tradition that developed over time.
The question I'm asking is not, was it considered right or wrong at the time of biblical slavery?
It was wrong.
Was it wrong?
It was wrong then to hold a slave.
It was wrong, but it was not considered wrong. Ir čia tavo religijos pasiekmė. Okay.
Yes, it was wrong then to hold a slave, obviously. And also, if you are God and you are pragmatic...
Ir jeigu egzistuotų tik religija, kaip tu vieną dieną sužinotum, kad tai vis dėlto yra wrong? Tu neturi kaip sužinoti, nes kam tu keisti tikėjimą savo. Bet vat, kai egzistuoja filosofija ir kitos mokyklos minties, kur tu realiai turi atsakinėti klausimus ir kas iš tikrųjų yra moralu ir nemoralu atsakyti, tada žiūrėk, religija turi prisivyti visuomenę, nes visuomenė į priekį. Nes religija pateisino absurdiškų dalykų. Ir jeigu egzistuotų tik ta religija, visi būtų ir tikėję tais dalykais, kaip ir tikėjo.
Attempting to woo people away from slavery, was it a practical
Aš nežinau, čia yra žiaurus aunas Shapiro pozicijai, bet greičiausiai žmonės taip nematys to, gal ar taip pražies, kad čia toks, gal vos, bet čia yra neįtikėtinai didelis L pralaimėjimas Shapiro pozicijai.
To simply, quote-unquote, abolish slavery, or
here's an idea, for example, in the book of Exodus, God says, I think in chapter 21, maybe 22, says that if you have a Hebrew slave, you are to let them go after 7 years. If that Hebrew slave comes to you with a wife, then after the 7 years, you let them go too. If you give the Hebrew slave a wife, and they have children, then after those 7 years are up, you give the man a choice. He can go after the 7 years, as per, but you keep his children and his wife. Or, and here the scripture says, if he says, I love my wife, I love my kids, and my master, as if that's going to be one of the principal considerations, then he can stay with you, at which point you take him outside, you pierce his ear like cattle, and he becomes your property for life. Now, here's a suggestion, for example.
Jesus.
If it was already established that Hebrew slaves go after 7 years, and it's already established that if they come with a wife, they can go after 7 years, then if I give them a wife and they have children, would it not be, it doesn't seem to me particularly revolutionary. It doesn't seem to me the kind of thing that would have caused such social discohesion that God just couldn't have found a way to do it, to say, well, why not let the whole family go free after those 7 years? With the knowledge beforehand that if you give this Hebrew slave of yours a wife and children, they'll get to leave with them. That seems to me, for example, a minor improvement that would not cause this kind of revolutionary earth-shifting, he couldn't have just gotten away with slavery. Maybe that's true. But something as obvious as this to me, it seems that if that is the case, that could have easily been done, then the failure to do so and the keeping of that Hebrew wife and their children as the master's property, that itself becomes an immorality that is dictated.
If I agree with your premises, I agree with your conclusion. I think that the question as to how much social discohesion would it have caused to do a thing is an open question. I think the other question that sort of remains open here is the incentive structure as to whether you accept a wife from your master. Right, so I don't want to get into the abstruse. I mean, we can do this literally all day.
And step from the past into the future.
There's 70 volumes of the Talmud that are literally about this sort of stuff, and then copious writings in terms of reinterpretation.
Yeah, we're hardly the first people to talk about this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is not the first time these questions have come up. But I think the general point is sort of one where either we can dive into that full time, and you can spend your life becoming a rabbi, which enjoy.
Could happen.
Could you have the beard for it. Your beard is further along than mine. Or we can sort of stipulate at the top that there are certain biblical interpretations that are abstruse and difficult, and that has been a reality of religious life since the beginning.
Well, I can agree with that.
We need to step from the past into the future through this conversational portal that we've got available to us. Obviously, everyone at this table would agree that holding a slave is wrong, in the same way that the man you kept talking about who you thought was coming to kill you, we would all agree that that's a problematic thing. And it does seem, so I'm not going to get you to defend this, because I want you to come up with another game show where you solve the future problems of society for us, Alex. It does seem that on an atheist worldview, it is difficult ultimately to say what is good, what is right, what is wrong.
It is difficult, and it should be difficult. Kad tą nuspręstum, kad atsakytum tos klausimus, reikia labai daug mąstyti, ir tai yra sunku, ir tai turi būti sunku, ir tai yra pliusas. O netikėjimo, kur pasako ir klausai, ir negali klausti kodėl, ir negali mąstyti, nes tau duoda gerą exitą. That, I don't know.
But we can be practical about it, we can be functional about it. So, come on then, for the future, give us some practical secular philosophies that can really help to build social cohesion for the future. You've got about a minute to do that, then we'll give Ben a minute to respond, and then we'll wrap up.
I can provide an answer that I don't think will be cause of further debate, which is to say
that'd be shocking.
Yeah. I think everything that I've heard you say, Ben, on this subject, and everything that I think you may be about to say, not everything, but some of it, involves saying that, look, you know, what we need to do is encourage strengthening family and having children and you know, not doing drugs and all of this kind of stuff, which people, like you say, have traditionally, this has been somewhat the prerogative of the church to maintain. I think that people just don't believe in God anymore, and so what I would say is just to encourage those things without the God. The question I would leave, and I'm sorry, I've just promised no debate, but here's something. Look, suppose it's the case that I agree wholesale with your proposition that religion is good and maybe even necessary for society in some way, right? Suppose I just say that that's true. I don't believe it's true. I've tried, I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. And so, I'm now left with a choice here. I don't think it's true, but I become convinced that it's somehow useful or beneficial. What am I to do with this information? You can't just choose to believe in God. People say you can choose to act as though you believe in God. That's kind of true until something really testing comes along. If you don't really believe it in your heart, you will falter at the first opportunity. How am I to raise my children? Am I to lie to them? Am I to say, well, I don't believe in any of this nonsense?
Jo, čia, aš net, čia įdomi perspektyva tokia, kad, jo, tipo, aš pritariu, taip gyventi negalima. Kai tu sužinai teisybę, tu negali tiesiog užmiršti ar įtikinti save, kad užmiršti, tu negali to daryti. Tipo. Once you go black, you can't go back, taip sako jo, tipo, čia su religija tas pats veikia. Kol tu esi tame, sure. Kol tu esi echo chamberį, tol atrodo viskas gerai, bet jeigu tu gauni dalelę dvejonės ar kito to dalyko, tu niekad nebegali atgalėti. Tu niekad nebegalėsi atgalėti. Tai grauž tave, iš vidaus grauž tie klausimai, kur kyla. Ta dvejonė, kol jinai bus atsakyta jau ne religijos ir ne to echo chamberio pagalba, tu jau bus ištrūkęs, tu negalėsi grįžti atgal.
But because I think it, you know, promotes a sort of non-replacement, birth rate, then I'm just going to bring them up believing things that I think are false. Yeah. I don't think this can happen. It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question, that outgo the idea of being, you know, truthful and being honest and talking about things that you think are philosophically sound. Now it's essentially faith-based, and it's about trying to make as many people, you know, the greatest good for the greatest number across society and societal cohesion, even if you think it's false. In other words, I'm someone who is an atheist, I don't believe it's true. If I just grant everything you've said about the utility that religion provides, what am I to do?
So let me ask you.
You've got about 30 seconds.
So, I mean, it's a quick question, which is, do you know it's not true, or do you not believe that it's true?
I don't believe that it's true.
You believe that it's not true, or you don't believe that it's true?
I believe that it's not true.
You believe that it's not true in a full...
Jis gali žinoti, kad... Ar galima sakyti? Nu jo, I guess tu negali sakyti, kad aš žinau, kad tai neteisybė, nes nėra įrodymo, I guess, bet jo, čia Shapiro klausė, jo, žinau, kad nėra įrodymų tam, kad tu žinai, kad teisybė yra.
Fashion.
Let's say that's the case, yeah.
Right. So if you believe that, then obviously I think that you're wrong in the sense that as I said right at the outset, I think that a lot of atheists are more religious than religious people. Religious people constantly admit to doubts
that's completely
and
not
problems
true.
in interpretation and all the rest of this sort of stuff. I don't think that a true religious believer can be truly religious without experiencing those doubts, because you're taking a leap of faith right off the top. And what I would normally say to somebody who is not fully committed to disbelief, I would say, is that you'd be in the position of being able to say to your kid, I don't know if it's true or not, which I think is a more honest answer,
yes.
by the way.
I
think that is something that you can teach your kids. You can say, here's...
Už tą tai jo, bet čia gal nebuvo visai, ką Aleksas klausė. Bet jo, tas tai visiškai teisybė. Aš tą advokatuoju, neprisim pozicijos, sakyk, nežinau. Bet tada religija neegzistuoti ir negali egzistuoti. Ir visas Shapiro tikėjimas religija tiesiog neegzistuoja, nes jis reikalauja, kad tu actually tikėtum. Tai jo, bet jo, toks atsakymas, good. Shapiro čia gerą atsakymą davė turbūt.
An atheist perspective, here's a religious perspective. I don't know what's true. I can provide you evidence on my
I'll
side
take it.
why I don't believe it fully, but there are people who provide evidence on the other side and arguments on the other side.
Jo, bet tie arguments ir evidence, tai nėra evidence. Tai yra tikėjimas tiesiog. Tai bus argumentai, bet tai nebus įrodymai. Tame yra problema. Ir jeigu tu paaiškinsi, jeigu savo vaikui tabula rasa, gimė tiesiog ir tu kažkaip, tarkim, turi tam būtybei, tarkim, net ne vaikas tavo būtybei tabula rasa nieko nežino apie nieką, paaiškinti. Kad aš nežinau, kaip yra iš tikro, bet vat yra tikėjimas ir, pavyzdžiui, mokslinis procesas. Nu, pavyzdžiui, dvi skirtingos mąstymo stovyklos, tarkim. Tikėjimas, tu niekad nepaaiškinsi, va šičia yra įrodymai šito, šičia įrodymai šito. Vienas turi įrodymus, kitas neturi įrodymų. Vienas turi tiesiog aklas tikėjimas be įrodymų, literaliai tikėjimo apibrėžimas, kitas va yra procesas, yra pagal logiką, pagal procesus, po kuriuos mes žinom dalykus, netikimo žinom dalykus. Tai jeigu tam tabulai rasai papasakos ir jis suvoks, kas yra kritinis mąstymas, kaip vertinti informaciją ir panašiai, religija neegzistuoja, religija negali egzistuoti. Bet Ben Shapiro galvoja, kad racionalus žmogus, žinai, priims tą logišką atsakymą su įrodymais, kad religija vis dėlto yra tikra. That's not true. Never.
That are not foolish, that are not...
Religija egzistuoja vien dėl to, kad žmonės yra flawed labai ir mąstymo procesai yra arba neišlavinti, arba nežino, arba sutrikę. Arba psichologinės problemos kartu kombinuotos su mąstymo procesais sutrikusiais arba nepakankamai developintais. Vien dėl to religijos visos gali egzistuoti. Tai yra žmonių ignorance. Jeigu žmonės nėra ignorant, jeigu turi informacijos, religija negali egzistuoti, nes tai yra žinojimas. Tikėjimui nebelieka vietos. Ir tą matom istoriškai. Visus tikėjimus pakeitė žinojimas su laiku.
This guy crazy, you know, like and make your own decision. I think that's the way that you would address that with a child. If you're somebody who believes in the social utility of religion but doesn't necessarily believe in the religion itself. I think giving the child the ability to choose that themselves by saying I'm not sure, or by presenting both sides of the argument would not be a bad way to go. I mean, just in terms of practical solutions. In terms of what I would say to better society, I have a much easier answer, which is I think that you should re-engage with your social institutions, including your church. I think that saying to people on an individual level, don't do drugs, study hard for your tests, get married before you have kids, get a job. Like it's easy to say that to people, and I think that without supporting social institutions that reinforce that nearly every day and make it part of the culture that surrounds you, it's very difficult for people to live that. And so I think that removing God as sort of the capstone of these institutions, the whole institution tends to fall apart. So on a practical level, if you get rid of God, the institution just ceases to exist, and you can yell as much as you want, but individuals are far less likely to provide the social reinforcement and social networks for support that actually create the bases of a good, fundamentally solid civilization than an individualist civilization in which all you can do is basically encourage someone to quote-unquote do the right thing.
Amen. Well, the fact we've managed to keep Ben Shapiro within the 24 minutes is a miracle in itself, a miracle that Alex doesn't believe in. But we have been talking today on the big conversation about religion and whether it's good or bad for society. And I've been joined by two literally world...
Gerai, mes baigiam šitą video. Aš lieku prie savo atsakymą, kurį daviau realiai pradžioj, bet... Alekso, vėlgi, daug stipresnį argumentą, daug geresnį, bet Benas niekad negali turėti gerų argumentų šitai temai, bet čia girdėjom turbūt geriausia, ką galima pasiūlyti iš tos pusės. Arba bent jau labai arti geriausia, bet ja, we're done su šito. Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdim man gelia.
thinking money is the man.